Chapter 498. Bai Ishue and the rest were exhausted from the prolonged battle, and could only unleash half of their peak combat power at most. Even so, it was enough to prove that these hemp-clothed men's combat power was not to be underestimated. It was enough to be called terrifying. Bai Ishue and Marquis Yin were Heaven Realm experts. Even when their combat power was incomplete, they were still far above ordinary 10th perfection peak realm experts. Bai Ishue mustered his remaining strength to fend off the dozens of hemp-clothed men. Right now, Bai Ishue was the only one among Yutong's remnants who could still fight. After all, his 6th heaven-level ability was no joke. The strange formation that the hemp-clothed men had constructed could stop the others, but it was not enough to stop Bai Ishue. As Bai Ishue fought the strange formation, he caught a glimpse of 7 to 8 hemp-clothed men, with gold embroidery on their sleeves from the corner of his eyes. These people were obviously of higher status than the group that had appeared earlier. They were watching from the sidelines, waiting for a better opportunity to strike. Bai Ishue almost spat blood at the thought. Ma-clothed Gold Hook, how dare you interfere in this battle? Are you seeking death? A sneer appeared on the hemp-clothed men's withered face. It's still up to you to decide who is the one seeking death. Bai Ishue cried out angrily. The Ma-clothed sect has never been involved in the war between nations. It has never been involved in the mundane world. What does the war between the two empires have to do with you? Aren't you afraid of going against the rules of your ancestors and incurring the destruction of your sect and the end of your lineage? The Ma-clothed sect was one of the top 10 sects in the Tianxian continent. The only weapon in this sect was the single hook, an unorthodox weapon. Furthermore, the material of the hook was a symbol of the status of the person in the sect. Those who used gold, and a special kind of star gold, to forge their golden hooks, were all important disciples and core members of their sections. In spite of this, the Ma-clothed sect had always stood aloof from worldly affairs. It had never involved itself in the martial world's quarrels, nor had it intervened in the war of empires. It was said that the founder of the sect had once left a message. I have no enmity with the world. I am not tainted by the mundane world, nor have I fallen to the 9 underworlds. Generals, ministers, nobles, what does that have to do with me? My descendants must remember not to provoke gratitude or enmity. Once a grudge is formed, it will never end. Because of that, the Mai sect had never been involved in the affairs of the dynasty. They were only limited to making a name for themselves in the martial world. Whenever the dynasty rose and fell, there was never a trace of the Mai sect disciples. It was to the extent that every new disciple had to swear in front of the ancestor's statue that they would never be involved with the troubles of the dynasty. In spite of this, the Mai sect had appeared publicly to help Dongxian in the battlefield against Yutong. Furthermore, their current target was Yutong's old marshal Qiu Jianhan, an important figure. Bai Ishue could not figure this out no matter what. What was the reason for the Mai sect to suddenly go against their founding masters' will and join in this matter? This was too unnatural. No matter what, the reality was that the Mai sect's participation in the war had doubled the resistance to Bai Ishue and the others. With these people as the main attacking force to keep Bai Ishue and the others busy, Dongshuan's deicide archers could choose their positions and execute their attacks with ease. The power of the deicide arrows was not something that Bai Ishue and the others could ignore. A moment of carelessness could severely injure them. With these two restraints, Bai Ishue and the others were truly entangled here, unable to advance any further. Yin Yang was still charging forward bravely. Behind him were mountains of corpses and seas of blood. It was a hellish scene. However, the saber in his hand had already been chopped 13 times. He had already seen the men in hempen garments. He also saw the immense pressure Bai Ishue and the others were facing with the participation of the men in hempen garments. The situation had become dangerous once again. Yin Yang was enraged. My sect. The roar was like a bolt of lightning that shook the sky. At that moment, the men in hempen garments who had been watching the battle had joined in the fight against Bai Ishue and the others. The only one or two who had not joined in the fray turned around instinctively upon hearing the bellow. Amidst the mountains of corpses and seas of blood, a purplish-red silhouette was charging towards them with a murderous aura. like a god of death that had emerged from hell. He was still hollering, "Children and grandchildren, remember this, do not seek vengeance. Once a grudge is formed, it will never end. Men of my sect, you must remember what your founding master has said. You must remember what you have done today. Since you have broken your vow, you shall receive your retribution." The billowing anger and murderous intent in his voice caused the pupils of the man in hempen garments to shrink. In a trance, it was as if his founding master was walking towards him amidst the mountains of corpses and seas of blood. The menacing aura was the same. "Who are you?" the man in hempen garments asked in a low voice. Yin Yang swung his saber, creating another empty space around him as he said menacingly, "If my sect retreats now, I can promise here that nothing has happened. However, if all of you are still stubborn, I shall kill my way up to Mount Matu and annihilate your my sect, so that all of you can answer to your founding master's vow. What are you going to do? Decide quickly." The man in hempen garments shuddered before he suddenly sneered and said, "You are but a child who is still wet behind the ears. How dare you threaten the my sect? We won't retreat. What can you do?" Yin Yang chortled. All right. Just you wait. His words reverberated in the air, still deafening and intimidating. The man in hempen garments could not help but shudder when he heard the voice. Then, the purple silhouette stepped out from the crowd, raising his arms continuously as bolts of cold light shot out from his hands like lightning bolts. The cold lights were the weapons he had snatched from the surrounding enemies, tossing them as he snatched them. Then cries of agony could be heard. The deicide archers who were already in position and ready to go were killed by Yin Yang, one after another. Hundreds of cold lights were hurled continuously, but none of them missed their target. In just a few breaths, hundreds of deicide archers had gone to the underworld. Yin Yang was still in midair when Reddy's mobility increased tremendously after losing the weight on its back. With a long neigh, it stretched its long legs and charged forward again. This time, it leaped 30 feet into the air, stepping on the heads of the enemies as it flew. A horse was actually able to achieve such a shocking leap. Everyone who saw it felt their scalps go numb, as if they were dreaming. After Yin Yang tossed his weapons to kill the deicide archers, he flew into the sky and glided through the rain of arrows, before he landed abruptly. He landed right in front of Bai Ishue and Marquis Yin, facing the Mai sect members directly. The steel saber in his hand glowed abruptly. It was Saber Truth, Destiny Blade. Merciless saber, the secular world beyond the saber, life and death in a single thought. With a loud cry, 2 styles and 4 styles were executed simultaneously. As the saber style was unleashed, hundreds of feet of space was filled with the cold gleam of the saber light, leaving no room for maneuver. Then, a series of agonizing cries rang out incessantly. 17 Mai sect members were either turned into a messy pile of mangled corpses on the spot, or their broken bodies were flung away. However, there were no more signs of life in midair, all of them dead. Yin Yang's voice rang out fiercely, "Life lies ahead, charge with me." Then, he took the lead and charged back the way he had come. Yutong's remaining troops perked up when they saw the situation. What a good saying. Hope lies ahead. As long as there is a chance, there is hope. What people are most afraid of is losing hope. Stop them. Zhang Ji's voice rang out anxiously from afar. He had never expected that his suicidal tactic would not be able to stop the purple silhouette. Could this person's ability be even greater than that D***ned by Ishue? Yin Yang was enraged when he heard the voice. His gaze turned cold as he extended his arm, and a spear was already in his grasp. In the next moment, the spear had already turned into a ray of light that pierced through the sky. Suddenly, it crossed a distance of several thousand feet in an instant, as if ignoring space itself. It suddenly stabbed into the long flag that Zhang Ge was hiding in. With an explosive boom, Zhang Ge let out a loud cry and fell from the sky. Dongshuan's military governor's flag fell as well, the top part of it scattering like it had exploded. Chapter 499. Following the abrupt change in Zhang Ji's flagpole, Dongshuan's war drums and horns stopped abruptly. What followed was a momentary pause in Dongshuan's offensive rhythm. Too many people had seen the shocking scene of Zhang Ge, the temporary marshal, falling from the flagpole. The fate of the marshal who was commanding the battle was unknown. It was a huge blow to any army, and Dongxuan's army was no exception. The morale of the army was thrown into disarray. At that time, Zhang Ge had been commanding the battle from above, so he had not noticed the spear flying through the air. When the spear struck the flagpole, the entire flagpole shook. Only then did Zhang Ge feel as if his entire body had been struck by lightning from the ninth heaven. For a moment, his soul left his body, as if he had been electrocuted. In the next moment, Zhang Ge was pushed away by the reverberating force, plummeting down like a kite with a broken string. Zhang Ge was considered lucky. At least at this moment, his body was still intact. Chido, on the other hand, was not so lucky. With a loud bang, it exploded like fireworks. Zhang Ge fell straight down. The incident had come too suddenly that no one could react in time. Finally, Zhang Ji's body landed on the ground with a loud thud. His mouth was the first to touch the ground. With a soft crack, 2 white front teeth flew out. If it were not for the fact that Zhang Ge himself had a certain level of cultivation and had thick skin, he would have been extremely lucky not to have been smashed into a meat patty. Even so, when he struggled to stand up shakily, he still felt as if his head was filled with tofu dregs. For a moment, he was unable to think, and was completely unaware of his current situation. It was only after a while that he realized that the drums and horns on his side had stopped. He was so angry that he almost spat blood. "Attack! What are you all standing there for? Are all of you dumb?" In spite of this, Yin Yang had already killed more than half of the Mai sect's men, who had participated in the battle, like he was chopping vegetables. The dense golden hook formation had vanished completely. Reddy had arrived as well. Yin Yang mounted his horse and pointed with his saber as he hollered, "Everyone follow me." Before he finished his sentence, he had already taken the lead and galloped forward. His aura was much stronger than before. The Mai sect was left with more than 20 people. They could still fight, but all of them dared not move, their faces pale. Obviously, they were intimidated by Yin Yang's intimidating aura, intentionally or unintentionally opening up a path for him. This group of people had the same thought in their hearts. This person had said earlier that he would pursue this matter and the Mai sect. Was he serious? Wasn't this too ferocious? Taking advantage of this gap, the large group of men and horses rushed through. In the distance, the 2 sack-clothed men, who hadn't made a move since the beginning, suddenly floated up. The golden hooks in their hands shone brightly, and they looked like they were about to swoop down from the sky and forcefully intercept him. Yin Yang, who was sprinting, was still aware of the surrounding atmosphere and the danger. When he turned his head abruptly, his gaze fell upon the 2 men like a bolt of lightning. With a long howl, he raised his saber and said eerily, "My sect, I hope you won't regret this. Come on." Both men felt a chill run down their spines when they heard him. The aura that had been accumulated to its peak dissipated a little. In spite of it, the arrow was already knocked on the bowstring. It had to be fired. They said coldly, very well, very well. This old man would like to see how a young child like you can make the Mai sect regret it. You must escape with your life today, before we can talk about the future." Obviously, both of them had a high opinion of Yin Yang, linking his life and death to their revenge in the future. Yin Yang guffawed, his voice rumbling like thunder. "Today, with the millions of troops from both countries as witness, the immortal souls of both countries as witness, the moment I, Yin Yang, leave the battlefield, it will be the moment the Mai sect will be annihilated and vanish from this world." The millions of troops from both sides who were fighting each other actually paused in unison. Everyone heard Yin Yang's roar. His vow was earth-shattering and earth-shattering. That voice sounded bright and clear, but it was actually filled with boundless hatred and resentment. As soon as these words were spoken, the originally clear heavens and the earth actually dimmed, and there was even a bolt of lightning that suddenly appeared. It flashed in midair like a silver snake and illuminated the entire battlefield of blood and fire. In the middle of winter, when snow was falling, there was actually a bolt of lightning in the sky. Everyone was shocked to see such a strange sight. This untimely strike of lightning was an indication that heaven had already acknowledged Yin Yang's vow. What he had said when he rose into the air, and let the millions of soldiers from both countries bear witness, was actually a heaven's vow. Since the heaven's vow had been established, either the Mai sect would be annihilated or Yin Yang would be annihilated. Other than that, there was no third outcome. The two men in Mai were shaken, but they were enraged, their malice soaring to the heavens. This old man shall kill you today, and let heavens will bear witness. Both of them turned into two streams of light and charged over with an intimidating aura. Bai Yishue howled and was about to face the enemy head-on. Bai Yishue was confident that he could easily deal with these two men. You'll lead the group and charge forward later. Leave these two to me. Let's see who will perish under heaven's will. Yin Yang cackled, murderous intent overflowing from him. With a shrill howl, he turned into a bolt of purple lightning and went against the flow. Yin Yang, who soared into the sky from the horse's back, wielding his steel saber, was even more intimidating. At that moment, the heaven and earth fell silent. Saber truth, destiny blade. Wielding a saber was equivalent to wielding heaven's will. If heaven wanted you dead, who could live? Amidst the long laughter, the three streams of light collided with each other in midair with abnormal intensity. Saber truth, destiny blade's 3 styles and 6 styles were all executed by Yin Yang in one go, seeking to end the battle quickly. Boom! This collision caused the sky above the battlefield to explode, as if a huge bomb had been detonated. All the soldiers and horses within 1,000 feet were blown away like grass in the wind, falling down in all directions along with the wind. Only Yin Yang's holler could be heard in the sky. My sect is nothing more than this. With a flash, Yin Yang landed in front of them. With a long neigh, Reddy leaped up high and reappeared in its majestic form, catching the falling Yin Yang with its horse's back. Then, it turned into a bolt of red lightning and charged forward once more. When Yin Yang landed back on his horse, the two Mai sect members who had fought with Yin Yang just now were still flying in the air, blood gushing out of their orifices. The only thing they could feel now was the weakness in their bodies, unable to stop themselves from being flung away. While they were shocked, they were also bewildered and puzzled. Who was this youth? Young Master Yun of Yutong? How could a young master of a noble family possess such an exquisite saber skill? Although this youth's actual cultivation base was in the heaven realm, he was still much weaker than both of them. However, his saber skill was formidable. He had used the advantage of his exquisite saber skill to counterbalance the disadvantage of lacking cultivation base, and had even defeated both of them. At the very last moment, if both of them had not activated the Mai Golden Hook's final ability to self-detonate their weapons, to release a strong force to neutralize the shockwave, perhaps both of them would not only be suffering from severe internal injuries, but they would also be dead corpses. Yin Yang, who had gained the upper hand, landed back on his horse. He looked even more ruthless, his purple robe fluttering in the wind. As he galloped, a swishing sound could be heard as he glared and hollered, "Who will fight me?" His voice reverberated, shaking the entire battlefield. His aura was unstoppable as he led the charge. No one dared to stop him wherever he went. The force that had defeated the two Mai sect experts had happened in the sky above the battlefield. Everyone had seen it. In the face of such a super expert, wouldn't it be equivalent to courting death if he really stood in front of him? With the precedent set by Bai Yishue, the undefeatable experts could be indulged for a while. Everyone had their reservations, and there was no order from their higher-ups. So naturally, no one dared to stop him. Bai Yishue and Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yin Xiaoyao, were behind Yin Yang, one on his left and one on his right. They were like two peerless killing gods, unstoppable like mad tigers unleashed from the cage. The three of them joined forces, creating a huge gap in Dongshuan's army in just a moment. Nearly 100 Dongxian experts tried their best to stop them again, but they were killed the moment they met. By the time they reunited with the others, Yutong's army had already left. It was at this moment that Fu Baoguo's steel cavalry of the serving army arrived as well. After going through many obstacles, the two armies finally met in the enemy's formation. "Charge! Break through Dongshuan's army!" Yin Yang hollered, warning them that it was not the time to let down their guard. On the contrary, Their combat power was now trapped in the enemy's heavy encirclement. The resistance would not be much easier than before, so they could not afford to let down their guard for even a moment. As if in response to Yin Yang's warning, Yutong's horn and war drum resounded deafeningly. The other half of the steel cavalry that Fu Baogua had left behind, more than 100,000 men, charged forward. The elders of my hometown are on my shoulders. The nation's safety lies in my battle. Fu Baogua's voice was hoarse, but it was soul-stirring. Fight! Tianxian Cliff is behind us. The 9 Supreme's lords are watching us. They're watching us. With a loud boom, all of Yutong's soldiers felt a surge of blood rush from their hearts. For a moment, they felt like they were about to explode. Charge forward and fight Dongxian to the death. Chapter 500. Fu Baogua was a veteran in the battlefield. Although he hoped to save the old marshal, he did not use all of his troops for the rescue. Instead, he left half of the steel cavalry behind. After all, his current responsibility was to build another fortress of resilience to block Dongxuan's invasion as much as possible. However, the current situation had changed. With Yin Yang's forceful entry into the battle, his side's morale had skyrocketed, especially when the serving army and half of the steel cavalry had already joined the old marshal's remaining troops. They had to fight with everything they had now. Otherwise, not only would the old marshal's remaining troops not be rescued, the serving army and half of the steel cavalry would also be buried with them. By then, the loss would outweigh the gain, and the combat power that was used to build the new defense line would be greatly damaged. How could they resist Dongxuan's army for long? Judging from the current situation, Yutong's morale had skyrocketed. Not only could the old marshal's remaining troops be rescued, the first half of the steel cavalry, the serving army, would not suffer too much damage. In addition, the current situation was advantageous to Yutong. They could seize the opportunity to counterattack Dongxian and dampen their morale, which would greatly benefit the continuation of the war. In light of this, Fu Baogua had decided to launch an all-out attack. Yin Yang finally heaved a sigh of relief when he saw Fu Baogua's actions. He discreetly retrieved a few bottles of medicinal pills from his ring, giving 3 pills to each of them, and sending them to Bai Yixue and the rest. The group had already reached the stage of exhaustion, but they were barely holding on with their last breath. Seeing that the pills were right in front of them, they swallowed them all at once. It was obviously not the time for small talk. After catching their breaths, they mustered their remaining energy and charged out, killing their way in a frenzy. Dongxuan's army did not have a commander to issue orders at the moment, so there was no way to respond. It was a mess of chaos. When Zhang Ge returned to another flagpole, intending to continue issuing orders and regroup, he saw that Yutong's army had already gathered into a raging dragon and was charging forward. Yutong had successfully broken out of the encirclement and left in a cloud of dust. Seeing that the outcome had been decided, Zhang Ge came down dejectedly and sprinted all the way to Han Sanhe, grumbling, "Teacher, why did you?" Just as he said a few words, he felt that his tone was too heavy and disrespectful. This was definitely not the attitude one should have when speaking to a teacher, so he subconsciously shut his mouth. Han Sanhe chuckled. "You want to ask me why I didn't take command just now?" Zhang Ge nodded. Han Sanhe had not interfered in the battle to kill Qiu Jianhan just now. He had handled the entire situation himself. In fact, ever since they charged out of the western gate of the Fortress of Resilience, Han Sanhe had given up on commanding the army and passed all authority to Zhang Ge. "Qiu Jianhan is a few years older than me." Looking at the fluttering flags in the air, Han Sanhe sighed in disappointment and said, "In terms of military career, he's my senior and a bosom friend who has fought with me for a lifetime. Previously, I had no choice but to listen to your plan and injure Qiu Jianhan with a sneak attack. I was already feeling helpless then. Now I really can't bear to see my lifelong enemy, my lifelong rival, die so tragically on the battlefield, especially when he dies without a corpse or head separated from his body." Han Sanhe's voice was laced with too many emotions. Zhang Ge was stunned when he heard the words. Suddenly, he seemed to understand Han Sanhe's thoughts and felt a jolt in his heart. Dying on the battlefield was the fate of every soldier. It was also a soldier's highest honor. But it definitely didn't include being beheaded, when he didn't even have the strength to retaliate. To a warrior, it was the greatest humiliation, a humiliation that could never be washed away. The most fitting ending for a hero was to die in a fierce battle on the battlefield. However, after being ambushed, he should never lie on the ground with his last breath, only to have his head chopped off by someone else as a reward for his military exploits. The Qiu Jianhan of today might be the Han Sanhe of tomorrow, or even Zhang Ge himself in the future. His teacher must have seen himself in Qiu Jianhan, right? Zhang Ge, who was in Qiu Jianhan's shoes, was deep in thought. Since ancient times, famed generals are like beauties. Han Sanhe sighed, a little melancholy. Qiu Jianhan's hair and beard are all white. Ah. The pause in the middle of the sentence made Zhang Ji's heart feel like it had been struck by a heavy hammer. Indeed, be it the god of war, or the legendary marshal, they would have to fall from the long river of history. The glorious time that belonged to them would only last a few decades at most. Qiu Jianhan, like his teacher, was already an extremely fortunate existence. Yutang has already lost this battle. There's no turning back, Han Sanhe said dejectedly. I believe that even if Qiu Jianhan can keep his life for now, he won't be able to live for more than a few days. Zhang Ge, why must you behead a hero of a generation? No matter how despicable he was against the enemy, and how much of a headache he gave you, it's undeniable that he was an opponent worthy of respect. He was a hero worthy of anyone, especially a militant. Zhang Ge felt ashamed as he bowed in agreement, no longer dwelling on the matter. On the other side, amidst the chaos, Yun Yang and the rest had finally escorted Qiu Jianhan's carriage to Fu Baoguo's camp. Fu Baoguo sprinted over at once, asking anxiously, "How is old Marshal? Is he all right?" Yun Yang sighed. His mood was equally heavy, no less than Fu Baoguo's, perhaps even more so. In fact, he had wanted to ask the same question as well. He had wanted to do so when he had charged over just now. However, he dared not ask. He was afraid, truly afraid. He was afraid that what he would hear would be news that he could not accept. I've lost too much. I don't want to lose anymore. I can't lose anymore. I can't lose anymore. Oh my God. The question that had been lingering in Yun Yang's heart for a long time was asked by Fu Baoguo. He clenched his fists tightly. His ears perked up as he listened nervously, listening for the inevitable answer. Old Marshal is heavily injured now. He was ambushed by the phantom archer Jin Wudong during the battle at the West Gate and was shot. Bai Yixue looked ashamed. After all, Qiu Jianhan had been ambushed under his protection, but he had been ambushed. No matter what, it was a humiliation that could not be washed away. I've killed Jin Wudong in the midst of the chaos as well, Bai Yixue uttered weakly, but was met with a sharp glare from Yun Yang. The demonic archer Jin Wudong had always had the title of unrivaled archer in the world. Weapons like arrows had always been used exclusively by the military. There were rarely people in the martial world who would use bows and arrows as their weapons. Even if they did, it was just something that came along with it. There were hardly any who were adept at using it. However, this demonic archer Jin Wudong was different, because his main weapon, and also his only weapon, was the bow and arrow. This was also his only means of attack. His skills were all tied to the bow and arrow in his hands. It was said that this person's archery skill had been cultivated to the acme of perfection. The strongest bow in the military was no more than 6 stones. Even the deicide bow, which required a cultivator with a high mystical chi cultivation base to use, was only a 10-stone bow. Such a strong bow was almost at the limit of what a human body could bear. It was also the limit that a human could continuously wield. However, this demonic archer's bow was made of stellar wood as the backbone and the flood dragon's tendon as the string. Someone had tested it and found that at least 30 stones of strength was needed to draw this bow to its fullest potential. When the arrow was shot from this bow, it was so fast that it was invisible. Even a mystical cultivator in perfection of the peak realm might not be able to catch it with their naked eyes. It was said that he had to pause for a moment after his arrow had hit its target before the whistling sound of the arrow flying in the air could be heard. The speed of the arrow was even faster than the speed of sound. Other than being an archer, Jin Wudong was also an assassin. This time, even Bai Yixue did not expect that Dong Xian would actually invite this demonic archer to specifically target Qiu Jianhan in order to crush Yutong's army as soon as possible and to succeed. Even when Bai Yixue had displayed his prowess and killed the demonic archer, the old general had still been gravely injured by this man. How did things turn out like this? Yun Yang was relieved when he heard that he had only been ambushed. I'll go check on old Marshal. Bai Yi, come in and tell me what's going on. To Yun Yang, who possessed the endless divine art, there were few internal and external injuries that he could not handle. Even when Emi was no longer around, and the air of vitality was no longer there, Yun Yang was still confident that he could save the old marshal. After the city had been set ablaze, Qiu Jianhan had led the remaining troops out of the city and built a high ground at the west gate. He had even set up a formation 500 feet away from the west gate. It was a chokehold formation, the second natural stronghold of the Fortress of Resilience. If Dongxian wanted to enter Yutong's hinterland, they had to pass through the Fortress of Resilience. The Fortress of Resilience only had 2 gates, and it had been so since the beginning of its construction: the East Gate and the West Gate. You may have breached the East Gate, but as long as I guard the West Gate, you will still not be able to do as you please. There is no way forward. The truth was just as old Marshal Qiu had predicted. Although Dongshuan's troops were stationed at the Fortress of Resilience, they had been ambushed by Qiu Jianhan when they charged out from the West Gate, intending to invade Yutong. Under Qiu Jianhan's forceful command, the entire West Gate had become a barren land. Dongshuan's troops had wanted to ride on the momentum of their victory and had been focused on advancing forcefully. Who would have thought that the situation outside had already changed? A considerable number of Dongxian soldiers who had initially come out had died. The ring-shaped formation that Qiu Jianhan had led his men to set up could be described as a deadly formation. Its lethality was astonishing. Anyone who came out from the West Gate, no matter which direction they came from, could not avoid being bombarded by arrows. After all, the West Gate was only so big, and the number of people who came out at once was limited. They could not form a formidable combat force within a short period of time, so they could only allow themselves to be slaughtered. However, this situation only lasted for a day before Dongshuan's extremely passive situation was broken. Han Sanha had ordered the west gate of the Fortress of Resilience to be torn down. Even the wall had been toppled. With the western wall gone, Dongshuan's troops charged out like a tidal wave. The deadly formation that Qiu Jianhan had set up was no longer targeted, so it was difficult for it to be effective. However, old Marshal Qiu would rather die than retreat, sacrificing himself to buy time for Fu Baogua to build another line of defense for the Fortress of Resilience. Under the old marshal's relentless command, the battle lasted for 3 days and Dongshuan's army was actually contained. In spite of this, the old marshal's 50,000 men were left with less than 10,000 men after 3 days. It was difficult for him to do anything else. In spite of this, Qiu Jianhan seemed to have made up his mind. Since the Fortress of Resilience was gone, he did not plan to go back alive. He had been fighting on the front line all this while. No matter how Shangguan Lingxiu, Bai Yixue, Marquis Yun, and the rest tried to persuade him, Qiu Jianhan refused to leave. He was old and ruthless. Once he had made up his mind, not even a deity could change his mind. Seeing that old Marshal Qiu was about to be buried here with his subordinates, a turning point had arrived. It was at this moment that Dongxian sent out assassins that targeted the old marshal. The most famous of them was the phantom archer Jin Wudong. When the army was engaged in a new round of battle, Jin Wudong, who was dressed in a soldier's uniform and hiding among the troops, had approached Qiu Jianhan. The lethal arrow came swiftly. Bai Yixue had finally sensed the danger and swung his sword to intervene at the critical moment, but he was still a little too late. He had only managed to deflect the arrow by a tiny bit. It was fortunate that there was such a slight deviation. Otherwise, the arrow would have pierced through Qiu Jianhan's heart directly. Ultimately, the arrow had left a hole in Qiu Jianhan's body, piercing through his chest and back. Qiu Jianhan was severely injured, and on the brink of death. In his grief, Bai Yixue charged into Dongxuan's formation, sword in hand, and pursued the ghoul archer Jin Wudong, amidst the tens of thousands of soldiers, until the ghoul archer was chopped into minced meat. He had even wanted to kill Dongxuan's main general with an eye for an eye. It was also because of this that Dongxuan's mutual destruction tactic was triggered. Bai Yixue retreated in the end, resentful. Bai Yixue's killing spree had allowed Yutong to survive the battle that day, but Yutong had lost Qiu Jianhan's command. Without Qiu Jianhan, Yutong's defeat was already set in stone. Even when Shangguan Lingxiu raised the flag of the family of generals and tried her best to reorganize the remaining troops, there was only a slight improvement. They could not deal with the Dongxian troops that were surging out of Han Sanhe like a tidal wave. Marquis Yun was decisive, ordering the entire army to break out of the encirclement and retreat under the cover of the night. Since it was impossible, it was better to preserve as much combat power as possible and return to Fu Baogui's side to fight Dongxian and shake Han Sanhe together. Dongxuan's army would not let them go easily, of course. They gave chase from the back and swiftly surrounded Qiu Jianhan's remaining troops. At the critical moment, the two squads of steel cavalry that had been lurking in the surrounding forest could no longer hold themselves back. They would rather disobey Fu Baogui's military order and charge out to provide support. Both sides merged and retreated as they fought, finally persevering until Yin Yang came to help. Then, they met up with Fu Baogui's army that was stationed under Tianxian Cliff. Because of this, Yutong and Dongxuan's war had begun anew. Yin Yang entered the tent quickly and saw Qiu Jianhan lying straight on a simple military bed. His body was stained with blood, and there were a few wounds on his face as well. His flesh and blood were curled up, making him look menacing. Yin Yang did not even feel the old marshal's breathing. If it were not for the slow, weak rise and fall of his chest, Yin Yang would have suspected that the old marshal was already dead. Under the dim yellow light, the old marshal's white beard was stained with blood as he lay there quietly. Yin Yang's eyes burned, almost tearing up. This old marshal who had given his entire life for Yutong looked so desolate and helpless right now. Chapter 501. Yin Yang walked over quickly and grabbed Qiu Jianhan's hand. Without a word, he cultivated the endless divine art and slowly transferred the overflowing vitality into old Marshal Qiu's body. Only then did he begin to inspect Qiu Jianhan's current injuries in detail. Yin Yang could not help sucking in a breath of cold air. Even though he was a veteran of the battlefield, the old marshal had taken the lead, not avoiding danger. There were indeed many wounds on his body, but more than 90% of them were flesh wounds. Other than having Bai Yixue's protection, the old marshal's cultivation base was extraordinary as well, so it was not a big deal that he had not sustained any other serious injuries. There was only one fatal injury that had caused him to fall into such a state, but this one serious injury was enough to kill him. The arrow had been shot at the vital point of his left chest, piercing through his front and back. If one were to look at it from the surface, the wound could be said to have gone straight through his heart. How could a careless man be so fortunate? Fortunately, Yin Yang knew that Bai Yixue had managed to block the sudden fatal arrow at the last moment, when it was about to hit its target. It was fortunate that the slight delay had caused the arrow to deviate a little, when it pierced Qiu Jianhan's chest. Just a little, just a little. Otherwise, Qiu Jianhan would have died on the spot. Even so, Qiu Jianhan was still hovering on the edge of life and death. Perhaps, it could be said that half of his foot was already in the jaws of death, and it would be difficult for him to turn back. Even when Yin Yang saw it now, he was not confident. Yin Yang tried his best to save Qiu Jianhan, but after an hour of cultivating the endless divine art, Qiu Jianhan's injuries did not seem to improve at all. The endless divine art that Yin Yang had high hopes for, and had always been successful, seemed to have lost its effect today. Even the rate of his pulse did not increase, not even by a little. Qiu Jianhan was still lying in silence like before, but Yin Yang could clearly feel that the old marshal's remaining vitality was slipping away bit by bit. It was as if life no longer belonged to this old and severely injured body. Of course, Yin Yang was unwilling to give up just like that. Other than continuing to cultivate the endless divine art, he had also used all the superior spiritual medicine and superior medicine he had. However, this could only slightly slow down the loss of Qiu Jianhan's vitality. It could not actually stop it. At this moment, Yin Yang was filled with extreme hatred. He hated himself for losing the Nine Supremes' power at such a crucial moment. He hated himself even more for not being able to open his own divine sense space, even though his cultivation had already recovered. If he could open up the space and restore his connection with Emi, Qiu Jianhan could be saved with Emi's air of vitality. With Emi's help, even if the old marshal had breathed his last breath, Yin Yang was confident that he could save him as long as it did not take long. In spite of this, Yin Yang could only watch as his most respected elder slowly passed away in front of him. He could do nothing but sigh helplessly. The frustration of being powerless, but unable to do anything almost drove Yin Yang mad. Behind him, everyone watched Yin Yang's rescue in silence. Everyone held their breaths, afraid that the slightest movement would disturb Yin Yang. Everyone's eyes were gleaming with hope. They hoped that Yin Yang could create another legend and save the old marshal. Fu Baogua, Marquis Yin, Wang Dinggua, Shengguan Lingxiu, Bai Yixue, the four noble young masters. Everyone here shared the same thought. But in the end, they could only see Yin Yang's back, which had always been as straight as a sword, slowly slumping, as if he had lost all his strength and could no longer continue. How is the old marshal? Is he getting better? Fu Baogua's voice was filled with anxiety. When he asked this question that was meant to test Yin Yang's luck, his heart sank instead. He had already seen the glaring wound on Qiu Jianhan's body. This kind of injury was a fatal injury, a serious injury that could not be cured. No matter how profound his cultivation base was, he would still die from such a grievous injury. There was no chance of a fluke. The reason why the old marshal was still alive was because he still had a breath left in him. If this breath was gone, he could die at any moment. The dim and radiant path was different. Marquis Yun, Bai Yixue, and the others looked extremely grim. Shengguan Lingxiu's eyes were already glistening with tears. Her eyes were glued to Yin Yang's face. Among everyone present, other than Fang Mafei, only Shengguan Lingxiu knew Yin Yang's real identity. Initially, Shengguan Lingxiu had pinned all her hopes on him. To her, there should be nothing in this world that the Nine Supremes Lords could not do. Take today's battle for example. Their side had fallen into a hopeless situation, but Yin Yang's arrival had turned the tables, opening a path of survival in the midst of death. The counterattack from breaking the siege was immediate. In spite of this, everyone could see Yin Yang's dilemma. Shengguan Lingxiu still hoped that Yin Yang could say that there was hope for the old marshal to survive. If even Yin Yang could not do anything about it, then there would be no turning back. Yin Yang knelt in silence, his face pale and his gaze dull. Suddenly, he spat out a mouthful of blood. Yin Yang's injury had not fully healed. His hasty journey had already violated the taboo of an injured person. Then, he had charged into the battlefield and engaged in a fierce battle, especially the intense fight with the Mai Sect's two experts, which had worsened his condition to the point where he could no longer bear the burden. In spite of this, Yin Yang's only hope was that nothing would happen to the old marshal, and that the fortress of resilience would not fall. Now the latter had become a reality. Although the former still had a breath left, it was only a breath. It could even be gone at any moment. Both of these hopes were about to become a bubble. How could Yin Yang not be mentally and physically exhausted? He had tried hard just now, wanting to open up a space to connect to Emi and fight for the old marshal's life. However, the space still seemed to have disappeared completely, and Emi did not respond. In the past, the strange energy that flowed around his body, like his arms and fingers, could not be used at all. The power of vitality, the power of meteorite, the power of the nation's fate, the endless divine art's power to eradicate evil and promote kindness. As long as any one of these forces could be mobilized, Yin Yang was confident that he could stabilize Qiu Jianhan's injuries. At the very least, he would not die immediately. However, all these forces were sealed in his deific consciousness space. He could not contact or mobilize them at all. Yin Yang's heart sank, as if he had fallen into a bottomless abyss. Could it be that he had to face the painful experience of losing a close friend again? Thinking of this, his vision darkened. His emotions were unusually agitated, causing his old and new injuries to flare up at the same time. He could not help but spit out a mouthful of blood and almost fainted. "There's no other way. I can't do anything." Yun Yang's weak voice was like a hammer that hammered into everyone's hearts. Everyone felt their hearts wrench in pain. Shangguan Lingxiu's tears streamed down her cheeks. Even the 9 Supreme's lords were helpless. Was the old marshal hopeless? Fu Baogua lowered his head abruptly, the muscles on his face spasming as he fell to his knees. His forehead was pressed against the ground, as tears streamed down his cheeks soundlessly. As Fu Baogua fell to his knees, the tent was plunged into a sorrowful atmosphere. Cough. A faint cough sounded abruptly. Everyone turned towards the source of the sound through their teary eyes. Qiu Jianhan, who was lying on the bed, suddenly coughed, his chest rising and falling violently. Then, his eyes that had been shut for a long time opened. However, the old marshal's breathing grew more and more rapid, like a pair of bellows blowing against his chest. At this critical juncture, Qiu Jianhan had miraculously woken up. The old marshal opened his eyes slowly, his gaze still a little dazed, as if he was thinking about something. However, when he saw the few faces above him, his gaze shone faintly. His lips moved slightly, as if he wanted to say something. Shangguan Lingxiu pressed her ear closer quickly, but could only hear Qiu Jianhan's voice as soft as a mosquito's hum, barely audible. It was as if he had used up all his remaining strength to finally say, Yun Yang is here." Shangguan Lingxiu nodded, her eyes teary. He's here. He just arrived. He saved us from the siege." The old marshal's eyes shone brightly, as if he was suddenly invigorated. His voice grew slightly louder as well. "Everyone get out. Yun Yang stays." The old man's pale face miraculously flushed with a few traces of red. In spite of this, everyone present understood that this was the final radiance of a dying man. The old marshal did not have long to live. Chapter 502. Shangguan Lingxiu nodded, choking with sobs. She stood up immediately and said in a low voice, "Old Marshal has asked all of us to leave. Only Yun Yang is allowed to stay. All of you leave quickly." She knew that time was of the essence. The old marshal might not be able to last much longer. She pushed and shoved everyone out without a word, chasing them far away, isolating the tent from the rest of the crowd beyond 500 feet. The old marshal was at the final stage of his life. The contents of his conversation with Supreme Cloud, whose identity had been kept a secret before his death, must be of great importance. No one should listen, no matter who it was. If it were possible, Shangguan Lingxiu wanted to chase everyone off the mountain to ensure her safety. The 500 feet of space was still filled with the beating of war drums and the faint sounds of killing from the battlefield. The voices inside were so soft that even if the gods wanted to hear it, they would not be able to do so. Would they? Shangguan Lingxiu thought so. But the sorrow in her heart only deepened as tears streamed down her cheeks. For a moment, she felt weak and hopeless. Old Marshal Qiu Jianhan was the empire of Yutong's pillar of support. Now this pillar of support was about to fall. What would happen to Yutong in the future, given the current war? Would its future be bleak? Yun Yang resisted the searing pain in his chest and went over with great effort, saying, "Old Marshal, I'm here. Qiu Jianhan's gaze was starting to lose focus, but he stared at Yun Yang's face in a daze, studying it carefully and seriously, trying his best to focus his gaze to see clearly. Finally, a forlorn smile appeared at the corners of his lips as he said in a low voice, "All of them have left." "All of them have left," Yun Yang replied. Qiu Jianhan was still worried and said, "You go take a look, ask them to go further." Yun Yang's heart skipped a beat as he came to the entrance of the tent in a stride. Looking outside, he saw that everyone was already hundreds of feet away from the tent. They would not be able to hear anything from here. After making sure, Yun Yang returned to the bed. "Old Marshal, they're all very far away." Qiu Jianhan's gaze sharpened abruptly. He was still panting for a moment before he lowered his voice and said softly, "This old man can't make it this time." But before I leave, I still have an unfulfilled wish. Yun Yang said hurriedly. Old Marshal, please speak. Yun Yang will go through fire and water to fulfill Old Marshal's last wish. Qiu Jianhan mumbled softly. There's no need. This old man only has one question in his mind. I want to know the answer. If I don't, I will not die in peace. Yun Yang replied. Please ask away, Old Marshal. I will tell you everything I know. Qiu Jianhan coughed again, barely able to catch his breath. Yun Yang's endless divine art had been circulating in his body, helping him to hold on to his last breath, but he looked even more lethargic than before. Yun Yang's endless divine art had been circulating in his body, helping him to hold his breath, but he looked even more lethargic than before. His eyes shone as he looked into Yun Yang's eyes, panting as he asked, Yun Yang, are you? Was he Supreme Cloud? This was Yun Yang's biggest secret. Yun Yang had never revealed his secret to anyone. Now looking into the old marshal's eyes, Yun Yang did not hesitate as he leaned close to the old marshal's ear and whispered, Old Marshal, you're right. I'm Supreme Cloud, the only one left among the 9 Supremes. Qiu Jianhan's face was flushed, his eyes glowing even brighter. He stared at Yun Yang joyfully, liking him more the more he looked at him. He said in relief, The 9 Supremes are not extinct after all. This old man can finally rest assured. Heaven still protects Yutong. One of his hands groped about and finally found Yun Yang's hand. With an unknown strength, he gripped it tightly and stared at Yun Yang without blinking. This old man didn't guess wrongly. But this secret, you must keep it forever. Don't let anyone know, don't. Yes. Yun Yang's tears streamed down his cheeks, feeling like his heart had shattered into 8 pieces. The pain was so excruciating that he could barely breathe. Once again, he had to face the death of a loving elder. Could it be that this was his fate? Keep this secret. Yutong can survive if not. I know. I will never let anyone know my identity. Yun Yang promised firmly. Qiu Jianhan's breathing weakened bit by bit, but a satisfied smile still hung on his face. His hand was still gripping Yun Yang's hand tightly, his gaze still filled with love as he stared at Yun Yang and said softly, Good child, good child. Yun Yang could not hold it in any longer, suddenly bawling his eyes out. At this moment, this mighty Lord Supreme Cloud was crying like a child. Old Marshal, don't die. I've lost too much. You can't die anymore. I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore. Yun Yang was sobbing, his face devoid of any semblance of dignity. Qiu Jianhan's warm and loving gaze fell on his face as he said softly, Silly child. How can a person not die? His gaze grew distant as he murmured, Speaking of which, this life of mine is actually enough. It's just that my death, the country's safety, the old wife at home. His gaze was filled with unconcealable longing as he murmured, Can't give up. But the motherland is in chaos. How can we cherish this body of ours? Listening to the old marshal's murmur, Yun Yang, who had lost his soul, burst into tears as he was overwhelmed with grief. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses came from outside the tent. A voice bellowed anxiously, Marshal, urgent military news. Fu Baoguo's furious voice rang out from afar. Stop. What are you shouting for? I'm not dead yet, get down here. Obviously, Fu Baoguo was afraid that the sudden voice would interrupt the old marshal's last words. However, the galloping reminded Yun Yang of something. The mournful cries that had never stopped abruptly. He lifted his head abruptly, mumbling to himself. Horse military news? Ready. The old marshal's consciousness was blurred once more as he answered subconsciously. W at what? Yun Yang was stunned for a moment, before he jumped up in ecstasy. Old Marshal, you're saved. You're definitely saved. I've thought of a way. How could I be so stupid? The life-saving spiritual medicine is with me, but I can't remember it. Tears of ecstasy streamed down his cheeks. However, Qiu Jianhan's consciousness grew increasingly blurry as he murmured, Your Majesty, old Qiu has passed away. At this moment, the old marshal had actually fallen into a coma. It was obvious that he had reached his limit. Perhaps his soul would be sent to the underworld at the very next moment. Yun Yang dared not hesitate as he sprung up and stretched out his hand. A gleaming dagger appeared in his grasp as he tore off his robe sleeves and placed his wrist before Qiu Jianhan's mouth. With a slash of the dagger, fresh blood gushed from his wrist. Yun Yang's free hand pried the old marshal's mouth open at once and dripped his blood drop by drop into it. His own blood had miraculous effects, and this was already evident already. However, the old marshal was on the brink of death and might not be able to withstand such a huge amount of medicinal power. He could only rely on dripping his blood bit by bit, gradually, in order to bring him back to life and turn the situation around. The self-healing ability of ace cultivators was extremely strong. Yun Yang had only bled for a moment before his wound started to clot. Yun Yang waved his dagger again and cut himself, causing the wound to open up again. He repeated this process until he had dripped 3 big bowls of blood, before he finally stopped. So much fresh blood should be enough for the old marshal to turn the situation around, right? Yun Yang could not help but let out the breath that he had been holding in. He was shocked to realize that his head was spinning, and his organs felt like they were about to explode. Unable to hold on any longer, he stumbled and fell to the ground with a thud. The next moment, he felt endless fatigue and endless darkness surging over him before he lost consciousness. Chapter 503. When Marquis Yin and the rest had waited for too long, and finally rushed back to the tent to check on the situation, they were shocked to see that both men in the tent were covered in blood. One was still lying on the bed without a sound, while the other was lying on the ground without a sound. Everyone couldn't help but jump in fright, but then they discovered to their pleasant surprise. Yun Yang isn't dead. Shangguan Lingxiu exclaimed in delight. He's still alive. He's just fainted. It seems like he's exhausted from excessive blood loss. The old marshal was important, but in Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes, the 9 Supremes Lords were still more important, especially when the 9 Supremes Lord was Yun Yang, her something. Therefore, compared to everyone else who was concerned about the old marshal, her first target of observation was Yun Yang. The old marshal isn't dead either. Fu Baoguo's eyes were wide, his heart filled with bliss for a moment. He almost wanted to scream and jump. He's still breathing, it's much stronger now. His pulse is stable as well. This is a great sign, it's unbelievable. Everyone was indescribably ecstatic when they heard the news. Marquis Yun and Bai Yixue were still in slight disbelief, as they went over to examine him closely. Although Qiu Jianhan was still unconscious and in poor condition, there was a hint of redness in his cheeks. Even though the wound on his chest was still horrifying and ghastly, his pulse had indeed calmed down, a stark contrast from the terrible condition that had only occurred once a long time ago. Both of them were experts in cultivation, and came to the same conclusion in an instant. At least for now, although the old marshal was still unconscious, his life was no longer in danger. Although they did not know what kind of sequela such a serious injury would leave behind, whether he could wake up or not, for now, the old marshal who was supposed to die had survived. The old marshal's life was saved. One of Yutong's 3 pillars had not collapsed. Thank God. Shangguan Lingxiu was so overjoyed that tears were rolling down her cheeks. Although she was more concerned about Yun Yang, the old marshal was a respected senior to her, an irreplaceable pinnacle of Yutong's military. It was a great blessing that he was saved from certain death. Fu Baoguo grabbed Marquis Yun's hand and shook it as if he had gone mad. He was so grateful that he did not know what to say. Marquis Yun, sir, thank you for raising such a good son. Qiu Jianhan was gravely injured and his life was hanging by a thread. His condition was deteriorating by the day. During this period of time, no one else had come in. Only Yun Yang had been in the room previously. Qiu Jianhan's condition had taken a turn for the better. It must be Yun Yang's doing. There was no dispute about this, and no one would doubt it. Besides, the fact that Yun Yang was so tired showed how much effort he had put in. Fu Baoguo no longer had any doubts about old Marshal Qiu's evaluation of Yun Yang now. This child was indeed extraordinarily capable. The role he could play was even greater than his father's. There was no doubt that the father was stronger than the son. Marquis Yun looked at Yun Yang who had fainted and said softly, "Marshal Fu is being too polite. This is Yin Yang's duty. It's my duty to save old Marshall. There's no need to thank me, it's not worth mentioning. Fu Baoguo was flushed, his spirits high as he guffawed. How is it not worth mentioning? Whoever saves the old Marshall is my Fu Baoguo's savior second parent. Ha ha ha. Everyone chuckled at his words. After all, if Yin Yang was Fu Baoguo's second parent, then what about Marquis Yun who was standing in front of them now? Young Master Yun looks like his injuries aren't light either. The rescue process must have taken too much effort. Shangguan Lingxiu said rather anxiously. I think it's better to take him to rest first. Even if he's fine, he'll need a few days to recuperate. Marquis Yun smiled gently. If that's the case, I'll have to trouble Lady Shangguan. Everyone smiled meaningfully when they heard him. Shangguan Lingxiu blushed immediately, but she did not shy away. She picked Yun Yang up carefully and ran out as if she was running for her life. Ha ha ha. Fu Baoguo guffawed. Marquis Yun, it looks like good things are about to happen to your family. Since he had already hugged Yun Yang, how could he avoid the skin-to-skin contact? A certain someone's reputation was tied to the lady, of course. He had to get close to her. Marquis Yun smiled calmly and said, This child is really lucky. It is his duty to try his best to save the old Marshal. But he has gained this opportunity. What a blessing. Let's hope that this will work out. By the way, should this matter be considered as the old Marshal being the matchmaker? Everyone chortled when they heard him, praising Marquis Yun for his eloquence. He had even brought the old Marshal's blessings with his words. If the old Marshal wasn't doing well, how could he be the matchmaker? He was indeed a perceptive person. When they turned back to look at the unconscious Qiu Jianhan, everyone felt a sense of relief and relief. It was great that old Marshal Qiu was not dead, and the danger had been averted. Even though he was still unconscious, everyone felt like they had found their pillar of support. Their hearts were calm, and the war was stable. The enemies who kept challenging and invading outside did not seem as scary as before. Shangguan Lingxiu carried Yun Yang back to her tent, her face flushed and embarrassed. Once she entered, she realized that Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan had followed her in as well. Both girls were looking at Yun Yang with concern. What's wrong with him? It was Ji Lingxi who asked. Ji Lingxi's sallow complexion was still the same as before, as if she did not care much, but the flustered look in her eyes had already betrayed her. It was as if the pair of eyes had grown out of Yin Yang's face, filled with anxiety and inquiry. Shangguan Lingxiu sighed inwardly and said, He's all right. He's probably just lost too much blood, and is a little exhausted. With Yin Yang's cultivation base, he'll be fine after some quiet rest. While she said that, she thought to herself, what a sin. This girl who came out of nowhere is really Yin Yang's fiancé? Otherwise, why would she be so concerned? It was just that she had never heard of this before. Marquis Yun as a father did not seem to know about it either. Yu Rulan said, Lost too much blood? Younger sister, feed him some medicine quickly, especially those nourishing spiritual medicine. I think he must have lost quite a lot of blood. No matter how strong his cultivation base is, he won't be able to take it. She was, of course, talking to Ji Lingxi. Despite Yu Rulan's admiration for Shangguan Lingxiu and her closeness, Shangguan Lingxiu was still her sister-in-law's marriage. She could give in to anything, but she could never give in to her sweetheart. If she gave in just once, perhaps her lifetime of happiness would be ruined. She had to do it even if it was not the right time. Ji Lingxi understood her meaning and said, All right, I'll take it now. I'll take care of Yin Yang throughout the night today. He must recuperate in peace. Shangguan Lingxiu said, Of course, the medicine for both younger sisters will be fine. Do it quickly. Having said that, she retreated quietly. How could she not know that these two girls must have come from noble families? She was destined to be no match for them, in terms of heaven and earth treasures and resources. Since it was not as good as what they offered, she would use theirs. There was nothing more important than Yin Yang's health now. Since they were repulsed by her, she would go out first. There was no need to stir up more trouble. Otherwise, it would only make things difficult for Yin Yang. Standing at the top of the mountain, Shangguan Lingxiu's hair fluttered as her thoughts drifted. I'm a daughter of a family of generals. My life has long been destined to be spent on the battlefield. Who knows when I'll die on the battlefield? Yun Yang still has a bright future and a bright youth. Why should I be tied down by my love and hold him back? He's one of the 9 supremes. He has a myriad of tricks up his sleeves. He's a presence destined to soar through the 9 heavens. No one can kill him. I like him, but how can I keep up with his footsteps? Let it pass then. That's fine. Let it be. Despite her thoughts and her mood, Shangguan Lingxiu suddenly felt an inexplicable pain in her heart as she stood there. The sudden surge of sorrow was endless and difficult to suppress, as if her heart had been sliced into 7 or 8 pieces. This was the so-called heart-wrenching pain. She stood in the night breeze, tears rolling down her cheeks in a daze. Far away, the noise of battle could be heard from afar. The daughter of a family of generals laughed self-deprecatingly as she cried, Shangguan Lingxiu, oh Shangguan Lingxiu, even your love, even your abandonment, even your sadness, they all move with the sounds of the battlefield. Your fate has long been decided. Why drag others down with you? It's best for you to be alone for the rest of your life. Don't let those who have you in their hearts grieve the fated separation of life and death, never to be able to see each other again. Sister Lan, have we gone too far? Ji Lingxi said to Yu Rulan with a blushing face as she fed Yin Yang medicine. Sister Lingxiu has always been nice to us. I can see that she genuinely likes Yin Yang. Chapter 504. Yu Rulan sighed. How could I not know that I've gone overboard? However, I'm the only one who's gone overboard, not you. Besides, I had no other choice. Shangguan Lingxiu is a good lady, of course. She's kind and good-looking, and her family background is extraordinary. She can be said to be a rare beauty in this world. But girl, this man isn't anything else. You can't be silly on this point. It's because of her feelings for Yin Yang that I've prompted Sister Yu to do this. Ji Lingxi asked in bewilderment. Isn't anything else? What is it? Yu Rulan sighed again. I know that you're a silly girl who doesn't understand the ways of the world. As your elder sister, of course I have to think for you. Even when I know that I shouldn't, I have to do it. It's because Shangguan Lingxiu is kind, good-tempered, and beautiful that she's willing to disregard a girl's modesty for Yin Yang that I've done this. If she wasn't so outstanding and had done so many things, why would I need to worry about you and be the bad guy? Ji Lingxi was still confused. Yu Rulan felt helpless for her sister-in-law's ignorance of the world, and explained weakly. Let me ask you. You like Yin Yang, we both know this. However, have you ever thought of marrying him? To be together forever? Ji Lingxi stomped her feet and covered her burning cheeks. Sister Lan, how can you say such shameful things? Yu Rulan said. There's only the 2 of us now. What's there to hide? Let me ask you, Shangguan Lingxiu likes Yin Yang too. She's a girl, yet she's hugging Yin Yang without a care in the world. If she's not moved by him, how could she do so? She wouldn't do so even if it's in front of 2 armies. Therefore, deep down, she must be hoping that she and Yin Yang will be together. Here's the question. If the 2 of you were to compete, would you and Yin Yang be a pair? Or would she be with Yin Yang for a long time? Ji Lingxi paled. It's an undeniable fact that she treats you so well, and that she's a good person. But it's also an indisputable fact that she likes the same man as you. Will you give in just because she's a good person? Are you going to give your lifelong happiness to her? Yu Rulan asked in a low voice. Ji Lingxi grew even more perplexed as she mumbled. I really didn't think that far ahead. Yu Rulan smiled bitterly. So, how can I not be the villain? I'm already destined to suffer for the rest of my life. Don't tell me I have to watch you, his only sister, suffer for the rest of your life? Ji Lingxi was at a loss. It was obvious that she had never thought that in such a short time, with just a few simple words, her sister Lan had already fought Shangguan Lingxiu on her behalf more than once. But, is there no other way? Ji Lingxi murmured. Yu Rulan held her forehead with one hand, speechless. This silly girl, can you find another way to do this? Can you find another way? If he fought for it, he might regret it. But if he didn't, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Yin Yang had fallen into a coma due to excessive blood loss and mental and physical exhaustion. Qiu Jianhan, who had been nourished by Yin Yang's blood, was lucky enough to survive, but he was still unconscious. Yutong's two hidden invisible personages were both unconscious, but the war would not stop because of them. Perhaps, it should be said that the war of the century between the two empires would not stop because of anyone or anything. In fact, even from the moment Qiu Jianhan was rescued, the war between the two empires had not stopped for even a moment. Fu Baogua had spent all his time arranging his troops to defend against Dongxian, when he was not concerned about the old marshal. Fortunately, the old marshal had bought him a few days of time. Fu Baogua had used the terrain he had built these days to almost engage Dongxian. What made Fu Baogua feel the most fortunate was that Han Sanhe had not made a move ever since he had defeated Qiu Jianhan. All the battles now were being commanded by Zhang Ge. Although Zhang Ge could be ranked among the world's famous generals with his incisive tactics and strategic planning, he was not far from Han Sanhe. However, Fu Baogua had always felt that he could cope and persevere with the limited military strength he currently had. If Fu Baogua had to give a reason, it would probably be that as long as he was not facing Han Sanhe, the suffocating feeling of being in the middle of a raging storm did not exist. Yes, when he faced Han Sanhe, he felt like he was being suppressed and unusually passive. Now, however, even though his available military strength was still not much, almost twice of the other parties, he always felt more confident that he would not fall, that he would not lose. The truth was just like Fu Baogua's judgment. Every mistake Zhang Ge made in the war, or rather, it should be called a mistake, it should be the gap between commands. Fu Baogua could always grasp it accurately. Then, he would counterattack, or seize the opportunity to regroup and stabilize the perilous situation on his side. The situation was getting more and more disadvantageous for Yutong, because Yutong's military strength was decreasing rapidly in the battle. How could they not pay a considerable price in order to fight an enemy that outnumbered them? However, Fu Baogua could still maintain his composure. The time they had held out had far exceeded their expectations. Every day they could hold out was already a gain. Every day they could hold out, Yutong's chances of winning this war would increase. Fu Baogua did not hold back anymore. He divided his steel cavalry into 3 squads and attacked in turns. The remnants of the Baogua army formed 2 squads as well, supporting the attack with the steel cavalry. Other than that, Fu Baogua had also formed a specialized vanguard team, with the ace cultivators in the troop. This group of people was led by Bai Yixue, Fang Mafei and Marquis Yun. Their role was to attack the enemy's formation in turns. In spite of this, they would only launch their attacks when the enemy's tactics were lacking. Only then could they ensure that each attack could cause massive damage to the enemy, while minimizing the number of casualties on their side. Now Fu Baogua had gradually realized where his side's advantage lay. Perhaps his military strength, combat power, and number of people were not as good, and his overall situation was far behind the enemy. Furthermore, his defense line was in danger, and could be breached at any time. In spite of this, his biggest advantage now was the fact that he had 3 superb experts to watch over him. Bai Yixue, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Fang Mafei. The martial skills of these 3 people were unparalleled among the millions of soldiers of the 2 countries in this decisive battle. They were also his biggest trump card, his strongest asset. Fu Baogua ran over with a drooling face. Brothers, help me charge a little more. Bai Yixue was the most unfortunate of them all. Whenever something like this happened, he was the one who led the team 7 out of 10 times, who asked him to have the highest cultivation base. Besides, there were other reasons. Big brother, I've just charged once. Bai Yixue was even less courteous to Fu Baogua now, not even addressing him as marshal but as big brother. To be called big brother by a Heaven Realm ace cultivator, Fu Baogua should feel honored. Cough, old marshal's situation isn't very stable. Marquis Yin said. I'm a little worried. What if? Before Marquis of Heavenly Clouds could finish his words, Bai Yixue had already charged out with a dark expression. The sentence that he did not finish was the magic weapon that rendered Bai Yixue speechless. Qiu Jianhan had been shot by an arrow under his protection. It was a surefire. Old Fang, it's your turn next, isn't it? Old Bai. Fang Mafei sighed. Young master is still unconscious. I'm worried. What if he's shot by an arrow? Thus, Bai Ishua charged out again with a dark expression. He was cursing inwardly. Oh man, can't you King catch me? Just because of such a trivial matter. You're treating me like a laborer and ordering me around. How dare you? To think that I, Bai Ishua, was famous in the martial world back then, let alone the me now. Bai Ishua grumbled bitterly. Sigh. Who was the person I was protecting back then? I'd been through hundreds of battles along the way. When I reached the destination, I was covered in wounds from head to toe and almost died. But guess what happened to the person I was protecting? Marquillan asked. I'm not guessing. I'll just lead the team and charge. Bai Ishua charged out again, his face flushed. Oh man, you really can't make mistakes. This was Bai Ishua's reflection on this incident. If his weakness was really caught, he would not be able to turn the tables for a very, very long time. Although the situation had taken a turn for the better, Fu Baogua, as Yutong's marshal, was still uneasy. He was even more confused. According to the current situation, as long as Han Sanha pushed harder and broke through Tianxian Cliff, he would be able to sweep through the empire of Yutong. There would be no more obstacles. At the same time, it would also mean that the merit of the empire of Dongxuan's expansion would be in their hands. Furthermore, Dongxuan's position as the continent's hegemon would be established from then on, perhaps even stabilized once and for all. However, Han Sanha had suddenly stopped caring at this critical juncture. He had handed everything over to Zhang Ge. He had gone to the side to drink tea. What did this mean? Fu Baogua thought that this was incomprehensible. If it had been him, why would he not follow up on his victory at this juncture? Even if Han Sanha wanted to train his troops and groom his successor, there was no need to do so at this juncture. Was there? It was important to teach a disciple and train a successor. But was there really a need to train him at this juncture? To put it nicely, it was losing the greater good because of a small gain. But to put it in a more serious manner, it was a hindrance to the military's plans. The crime was unpardonable. Furthermore, it was obvious that they wanted to hand over the great credit of expanding their territory to Zhang Ge. This made Fu Baogua even more confused. Was Han Sanha an idiot? Chapter 505. Fu Baogua was at a loss. He thought about it again and again, but he could not figure out what Han Sanha was thinking or what he was plotting. Now that the Fortress of Resilience had been breached, Yutong's natural barrier had been lost. Although the new defense line that they had built was known as another Fortress of Resilience, where the people lived, the fortress would cease to exist if the people died. Fu Baogua felt that the pressure he was currently under was not as strong as when he was at the Fortress of Resilience. It was undeniable that Zhang Ge was a top-notch marshal. Although he was still not as good as Fu Baogua, he had slowly pushed Dongxian to the edge of victory with the initiative that he had accumulated bit by bit. Up until now, both Zhang Ge and Fu Baogua knew very well that the final battle would probably happen within a day or two. The final outcome would definitely be Yutong's defeat. This point was already the general trend, and no one could change it. Fu Baogua had stood his ground until now. Watching his men die one by one, he was already well aware of the situation. Although he was better than Zhang Ge in terms of military strategy, and his thoughts were more experienced and meticulous, he could not make bricks without straw. Tianxian Cliff would be the last battle of his life. If he did not become a deserter, he would definitely fall here. There would be no chance of survival. However, whether it was as Yutong's Eastern Frontline Marshal, the person who had made a pact with Supreme Wind that day, or just a Yutong citizen, Fu Baogua would never allow a second stain to be tainted in his life. I, Fu Baogua, would rather die here than take another step back. This is the Fortress of Resilience as well. I couldn't fulfill my vow to fall with the Fortress of Resilience. Let me truly live and die with this Fortress of Resilience that I've built with my own hands. Teacher, why? Zhang Ge had the same doubt as Fu Baogua. Han Sanha looked at the dark clouds in the sky with his arms behind his back and said faintly, I thought you would understand. In the end, you still managed to ask. Zhang Ge was taken aback. Teacher, Han Sanha sighed dejectedly. You will understand, Zhang Ge. I only hope that when the time comes, you won't take the wrong path. Zhang Ge was shocked and blurted out, "Teacher, could it be?" Han Sanha waved his hand, ending the topic. He turned to look at Zhang Ge and said, "Do you know why I want you to defeat Fu Baoguo personally?" Zhang Ge said, "Teacher, please dispel my doubts. This disciple will respectfully receive your teachings." Han Sanha said slowly, "There are many strange things in this world. There were also many strange things happening on the battlefield. But how did a famous general grow up? Based on this old man's lifetime of experience, there is only one path, and that is to step on the corpses of other famous generals to rise." This conclusion is also applicable to the commander-in-chief of an army. Only by defeating a commander-in-chief, who is of the same level, or higher than him, can one rise to fame. If this was all, it would still be within the scope of an ordinary person's understanding. However, there's another strange thing about this duel. When you fight a famous marshal on the battlefield and finally defeat him, you'll unknowingly learn his commanding method. It's like you've suddenly learned a lesson, a feeling of enlightenment that grows inexplicably. You've learned it all at once, and you've improved. You've taken a huge step forward, to an extent that you can't even imagine. Han Sanha said, "This is something that outsiders can't understand. Only the person involved will know. From what I understand, it's probably because you've fought him 8 to 10 times. It's the same battle before. But as long as there's no winner or loser, no life and death, you won't have this sudden epiphany. Once there's a life and death outcome, you'll definitely have this epiphany. Do you understand now? Defeating and killing Fu Baoguo is your chance." Han Sanha said softly but with a hint of melancholy, "When you really defeat Fu Baoguo, you'll be able to understand half of what I'm thinking now." Zhang Ge was shaken, but he said respectfully, "Thank you for your guidance, teacher." Han Sanha said slowly, "It's too early to thank me. If you can defeat Tai Zheng, then you'll understand 70% of me. If you defeat Leng Daoyin, you'll understand 90% of me." Zhang Ge felt like a war drum was ringing in his heart, unable to speak for a moment. Han Sanha said slowly, "As for fully understanding me, you'll have to fight me head-on and defeat me. Only then can you understand me completely. What I can't figure out now, I'm afraid you'll be able to figure it out by then." Zhang Ge was sweating profusely. How dare this disciple have such extravagant hopes? Han Sanha smiled faintly and said, "Where there's a will, there's a way. How will you know if you don't work hard? Now go and command the battle. If my calculations aren't wrong, the outcome will be decided before dawn the day after tomorrow. This war will end by the second half of tomorrow night at the latest." Fu Baoguo walked towards Qiu Jianhan's tent with a grim expression. Qiu Jianhan was still unconscious. However, there was an additional person in front of his bed. It was Yin Yang. Yin Yang was almost fully recovered by now. "How is it, Marshal Fu?" Yin Yang asked with a smile. This puzzled Fu Baoguo. He had never met this young Master Yin before, had he? Why did he feel like he was very familiar with him when he spoke to him now? Not good. Not good at all. Fu Baoguo sighed. The situation is really not good now. Fu Baoguo said with a grim expression, "Young Master Yin, I have a favor to ask of you. I hope young Master Yin won't reject it." Yin Yang said in a low voice, "Please speak, Marshal Fu. As long as it's within my capabilities, I won't hesitate. The defeat of this war is inevitable. Even if there are 1,000 clever plans, there's no turning back. This war can be lost, but Yutang can't be destroyed. The elites of our nation can't be wiped out here." Fu Baoguo said word by word. "So, I'd like to ask young Master Yin to escort old Marshal away. Only with young Master Yin's personal escort can old Marshal return safely, and I can be at ease." Yin Yang asked seriously, "What about you?" Fu Baoguo did not answer. After a pause, he said, "Shangguan family of generals young lady Lingxiu is the current benchmark of the family. She's significant and can't be allowed to perish here. Your father, Marquis Yun, by Yi Fang Mafei, and the rest are all elites of the empire. It would be the empire's misfortune if they were sacrificed in vain here. Other than that, the Shangguan family of generals, 8,000 family warriors, have fought until now. There are still more than 2,700 people left. Young master, please don't feel burdened. The escort troop that I can give you this time won't be more than 5,000 people. Without these people, how can everything be done? I'd like to make it clear here that this mission is by no means easy. In fact, it's exceptionally arduous. Perhaps it can be said that the Empire's future, whether it can rise again and be reborn, all rests on your shoulders. Fu Baoguo's expression was cold, indescribably determined. Yin Yang asked again, I understand what you've said, but I'd like to ask Marshal Fu to answer me. What about you, Marshal Fu? What about you? Fu Baoguo smiled faintly. I, Fu Baoguo, have promised Lord Supreme Cloud that I'll live and die with the Fortress of Resilience. It's a pity that I've gone back on my word under old Marshal's strict orders. Even if I say that I'll build another Fortress of Resilience, I've still gone back on my word. However, no matter how much I've gone back on my word, I can't run away in a fluster when I've arrived at Tianxian Cliff with the 9 Supremes Lord Spirits watching from above. As a soldier of Yutong, a citizen of Yutong, dying on the battlefield before the country is destroyed is the greatest honor of a soldier. Fu Baoguo said softly, as a soldier, if I'm still alive when the country is destroyed, it'll only be the greatest humiliation of my life. There's no way to wash it away. Yin Yang snorted and said, what are you talking about? Even if the country is destroyed, what about the soldiers who are still fighting unyieldingly, who are still contributing to the recovery of the country? I say they're all heroic men. How can they bear the humiliation that they can't wash away for the rest of their lives? Fu Baoguo said faintly, of course they're heroes, they're deserving heroes. However, they've never been at the front line before. I, Fu Baoguo, am at the front line now. This is the difference. If I can't die here, it'll be a humiliation that can never be washed away in this world. Yin Yang was silent. He understood what Fu Baoguo meant. The frontline defense troops' duty was to protect the country. If it was breached by the enemy, it would be an unpardonable crime. No matter what reason, there was no irresistible factor. No matter what, this crime could not be erased. Even when the entire nation understood that it was a last resort and could be forgiven, they themselves would never forgive themselves. They would always be brooding over it, unable to let it go. Furthermore, how many people in this world were actually rational enough to put themselves in the shoes of these border warriors? When the situation really came to a head, how many people would dare say that they could forgive them? Regarding my own safety, there's no need for young master to worry about it. I only have this one request. I hope that young Master Yin can help me, Fu Baoguo said. Yin Yang asked curiously, there are so many people here, and everyone seems to be more powerful than me, more suitable to deal with the current crisis than I am. Marshal Fu, why do you have to look for me? Aren't you thinking too highly of me? Fu Baoguo smiled. Why does old Marshal think so highly of you? Why did old Marshal not look for anyone else, but you at the very last moment? He doesn't even allow a third person to be present. These are my reasons. Chapter 506. The only regret of this battle is that I didn't get to see Lord Supreme Cloud, and I don't know how he's doing now. Fu Baoguo sighed deeply. I only hope that Lord Supreme Cloud is blessed by the heavens and that he's well. To me, no. To all of Yutong's subjects and people, as long as Lord Supreme Cloud is still here, Yutong still has hope. Fu Baoguo's eyes were looking at the distant sky, his gaze filled with nostalgia and gratitude. Yin Yang said softly, I didn't expect Marshal Fu to trust Lord Supreme Cloud so much. Fu Baoguo's head was still raised, his voice unusually indifferent. When Lord Supreme Cloud turned into Supreme Wind, he enlightened me and gave me a new life. If it weren't for Lord Supreme Cloud, I would have lost my reputation and died without a complete corpse. Yin Yang was shocked. He did not expect Fu Baoguo to expose himself in front of someone other than Supreme Cloud. Yin Yang was only Yin Yang, not Supreme Cloud. Naturally, that was how Fu Baoguo felt. That day, it was Lord Supreme Cloud who pulled me out of the abyss. Fu Baoguo said reverently, Lord Supreme Cloud is one of the 2 people I, Fu Baoguo, respect the most in my life. The other one is my teacher, Fang Qingtian. Yin Yang said, Old Grand Commandant Fang is of course highly respected, but Lord Supreme Cloud. He wanted to say that Lord Supreme Cloud did not expect to be repaid for his kindness, and did not wish for Fu Baogua to die in the battlefield. But before he could finish his sentence, Fu Baogua turned to glare at him and said loudly, "Ignorant child, although your surname is also Yun, and you're also the son of Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, a descendant of the royal family, and you've made great contributions, there are some things that should be said and some things that shouldn't be said in this world. I've blurted out the past in a moment of life and death, but I've heard such rebellious words. It looks like Marquis Yun's upbringing needs to be strengthened." Yun Yang was stunned. Fu Baogua's anger had yet to dissipate. "Young Marquis Yun, considering that we've been comrades, let me give you a piece of advice here. Thinking too highly of yourself isn't a big problem, but it's still a problem. Keep your mouth shut in the future, lest you bring death upon yourself. At least in front of me, don't make any presumptuous comments about Lord Supreme Cloud. You have no right to say anything good or bad about Lord Supreme Cloud." After saying that, he flicked his sleeves and left with a cold expression. He had left Yun Yang alone on the spot. Yun Yang was dumbfounded, speechless. "What did I say? I'm just saying good things. I'm thinking about you. Why can't you tell the difference between good and bad? So what if I'm talking about Supreme Cloud? I'm talking about him. What can he do to me? Supreme Cloud hasn't even said anything. And you're the one who needs to stand up for him? And what the hell was going on? I'm just speaking up for myself. And there are actually people who are defending me. It's so King awkward. This round of scolding was really a torrent of scolding. Night fell. This was actually the calmest night since the start of the war. Both sides knew that tomorrow would be the moment that would decide the outcome of the war. Yutong knew that tomorrow might be the day of their defeat, while Dongxian knew that they would charge past Tianxian Cliff in the battle tomorrow. From then on, the empire of Yutong and the fertile lands in the east would all belong to Dongxian, free to be ravaged. On this night, Dongxuan's troops were resting and building up their strength. Generals of all levels were lecturing and promising that as long as the battle was won tomorrow, how they would be promoted, how they would be crowned nobility for generations to come, how they would be rewarded, how they would. The eyes of the soldiers who listened were glowing with greed. Everyone was subconsciously imagining that after tomorrow's battle, they would be rewarded with unparalleled military merits and riches. If they could make more contributions, it might really be like what the officers had said. They would be crowned nobility for generations to come. Yutong's side, on the other hand, was silent. Everyone was trying their best to rest and adjust themselves so that they could have stronger stamina the next day. At the last moment, they had to kill as many invaders as possible. 1 or 2 would barely break even, 3 or 5 would be a profit. And if they could kill 8 or 10, that would be the final harvest that they would be able to die in peace. Countless people were silent, their heads lowered. However, the unprecedented aura of grief and indignation gradually spread throughout the entire army. They had fought until now, persevered until now, but were they still at the very last moment? Countless sacrifices, facing death countless times, but tomorrow was the end of the world. Was this the end of their lives? A veteran covered in wounds silently wiped the long saber he carried with him, and sang in a low voice. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, fighting for the country all one's life, the ambition to fight on the battlefield. When the enemy comes the bridge we pass, brother, you grab your saber, I raise my spear. Charging and breaking through the enemy lines together, riding and wielding our sabers together, celebrating with wine, the long mountain road together, the long journey to the underworld together. Brothers are comrades in arms are comrades. You don't lower your head, I don't bend my back either. I face life and death, splendor in one hand. I come to my battlefield, you go to your trench, because we're the pride of our hometown elders. You have your old mother, I have my young family. You have your beauty, I have my daughter. When the saber and spear are in hand, when the enemy comes, you my chest, my blood is burning. When I turn into dust, it's also a soldier's glory. When you burn and turn into a rainbow bridge in the sky, brothers, we still smile proudly, because we're Yutong's pride. You have the blood in your chest, I have the saber in my hand. You and I side by side fight today. If I die in battle, father and mother should smile. What's the point of a man's life if he doesn't defend his country? Father and mother miss me. Look towards the east. Look at the place where the flames of war are rising. I'm smiling proudly. Smile proudly for the rest of my life. Smile proudly for life and death. The volume of the song was extremely low. This was a song called Smile Proudly, composed by a soldier after a battle. It had gradually become popular throughout Yutong's military, becoming a popular military song that almost everyone could sing. At this moment, the hoarse voice was singing softly, but it seemed to carry a strange rhythm as it floated slowly in the night breeze. All of the soldiers who heard the song began to sing along with it. Some of the soldiers sang as they took out their letters from home, reading the letters that they had read so many times that they would shatter with just a flip. Even when the letters were already stained with blood and had covered their original contents, the audience read them greedily, word by word, over and over again. When they were done, they kept them carefully and placed them in the most intimate spot. There were tears in their eyes, but there was a smile on the corners of their lips. Some of the soldiers rested their heads on their sabers, watching the twinkling stars in the sky without blinking. Their thoughts were unknown, but they could only sing along softly. Gradually, the singing spread throughout Yutong's military camp, reaching the mountain where the army was. It was like a gentle breeze, lingering to and fro. Fu Baoguo was also humming a song, inspecting his troops from tent to tent. Before the battle that was destined to come tomorrow, he wanted to look at each and every one of his brothers, at least once. He wanted to remember the image of each of his brothers in his heart forever. Even when his soul had departed to the netherworld, he dared not forget them. He could not forget them. Are you afraid of death? I was, but I'm not anymore. What do you mean? Why aren't you afraid now? Because I'm not afraid now. Fu Baoguo recalled the young soldier, who was not even 20 years old, when he had asked the question, and the soldier's reply. He could not help chuckling, tears in his laughter. Although the soldier was only 20 years old, he was already a veteran who had gone through many battles. In the course of his young life, the battles he had gone through were numerous, if not uncountable. Tomorrow we will die in battle, Fu Baoguo's voice echoed. Brothers, who has any unfulfilled wishes? Speak quickly. If it's possible, I'll do my best to help him complete it. This might be the last chance. If you don't speak now, there won't be another chance. The song was still melodious, but no one answered. Following me, Fu Baoguo, to die, does anyone regret it? There was still no reply. The song continued in a mellow tone. Then I'll nag one more time. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. It will still be me, Fu Baoguo, who will lead all of you to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. It was Fu Baoguo's voice. The military camp that had been silent all this while suddenly roared deafeningly. That's right. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will still guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. Going to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. In the human realm, we won't rest until we die. In the netherworld, we won't rest until we die. No regrets. We don't regret it. The deafening roar was like the roar of a thunder god descending upon the world, ringing deafeningly through the entire mountain, shaking the 9 heavens. In the end, there were only 5 neat words. We don't regret it. We don't regret it. Shangguan Lingxiu, who was watching the scene from the top of the mountain, covered her mouth and choked with sobs. Big drops of tears rolled down her fair cheeks. She felt as if something was stuck in her throat. Fu Baoguo's Adam's apple bobbed up and down, unable to speak for a moment. His breathing was unusually heavy, like a broken bellow. Suddenly, he roared like a lion. Fight to the end. Fight to the end. Their ears were filled with the thunderous roar. Fu Baoguo suddenly guffawed. Brothers, all of us here. Remember to leave together tomorrow. No one is to be left behind. Your father's military law allows for beheading whether it's the netherworld or the living world. This is military discipline. There was a burst of laughter as the soldiers chortled. Your father won't be left behind. Not when we're alive, not when we're dead. What's there to be afraid of military discipline for? Let's sing. Continue singing. Fu Baogua roared. None of you have seen your father sing, have you? Your father will start today, and let you know your father's songs. Then, Fu Baogua was silent for a moment, as if he was brewing his emotions. All the soldiers stood up at that moment, puffing their chests as they waited quietly for the song that they had never heard before. The song that came from Marshal Fu. A moment later, Fu Baogua's passionate voice rang out. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield. I wrote this song until for last night. It took me a long time to revise it. Chapter 507. The 100,000-strong army, whether they were injured, resting, or on duty, echoed almost at the same time. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield. The song was led by Fu Baogua. The chorus was loud and majestic. How could a chorus of more than 100,000 people not be loud and majestic? At this very moment, all of Yutong's soldiers could feel their blood boiling. The entire sky and earth were trembling, fighting because of the singing of Yutong's soldiers. The song spread far and wide, reaching the clouds. The vigor of facing death with equanimity, the determination to fight until the very last moment, was as solid as a rock, unshakable, indestructible, and indestructible. It was so loud that even Dongxuan's camp could hear it loud and clear. The fervent pre-battle mobilization also involuntarily came to a halt. Many of Dongxuan's generals walked up to the higher ground in silence, gazing at the pitch-black hill on the other side. The deafening song was coming from the other side of the hill, their gazes filled with uncontrollable respect. Zhang Ge also stared at the other side of the hill in silence, his gaze exceptionally complicated. Only Han Sanha remained in his tent, not observing Yutong's movements. He stood with his arms behind his back, but the complicated expression on his lean face flickered back and forth. After some time, he finally walked out of the tent with his arms on his back, and came to the top of the hill. Zhang Ge was already standing there, looking at Yutong's camp. Seeing Han Sanha's arrival, he turned to greet him at once. Teacher Yu. There was hesitation and respect in his voice. But more than that, it was a contradiction that stemmed from his own self-doubt. It looks like you've realized it as well? Han Sanha said faintly. The song was still reverberating endlessly. Even the mountains and valleys around Dongxuan's camp were reverberating from the rumbling. Zhang Ge swallowed with difficulty and said, Yes, I feel that tomorrow's battle will be the most tragic battle I've ever encountered in my life. I actually have doubts about this battle that I've already grasped victory in. A bitter smile hung on Han Sanha's bony face as he said, Your feeling is right. The battle tomorrow will be unexpectedly brutal, but the outcome is still predetermined. Dongxian will win, but it will be a Pyrrhic victory. Perhaps, it will be a losing battle. I've only encountered such an army once in all the battles I've been through in my life. Han Sanha uttered word by word. 100,000 troops, 100,000 men of sacrifice. This is too scary. Zhang Ge said, Once. Back then, when we were fighting Shangguan Lingxiao, we had set up an ambush and bribed our spies. The encirclement was complete, trapping Shangguan Lingxiao in Sobbing Ghost Valley, 700 miles away from the Fortress of Resilience. We deployed 150,000 men, and surrounded Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men. That battle was just like that. Han Sanha's tone was filled with nostalgia. What was the result of that battle? Zhang Ge asked respectfully. I was personally in charge of commanding 150,000 men on our side. Against 20,000 men, we had set up an ambush in advance, our bows and arrows in place. It was a perfect time, place, and manpower. All three factors were in place. Our odds of victory were set in stone. There was no way we would fail. Han Sanha sighed. As for the result of that battle, none of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men survived. All of them were annihilated. When the battlefield was cleaned up after the battle, less than 500 of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men could be found with their corpses intact. Han Sanha said seriously. Zhang Ge suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body, a chill running down his spine as he asked anxiously, What about us? He was very familiar with his teacher's habits. By saying things like this, He was laying out the foundation for his side's losses. His side's losses would be a number that would greatly exceed his own expectations. Han Sanha said faintly, "Of the 150,000 men, only 76,300 came back alive." Zhang Ge felt his heart skip a beat. Breathing labored for a moment, his eyes almost seeing stars. They had the advantage of a geographical ambush and an insider, but they had still suffered a 1-to-4 casualty ratio. How is this possible? How could we, who had the advantage of time, place, and manpower, have suffered such casualties? Preposterous! Preposterous! Zhang Ge, who thought he had mentally prepared himself, blurted out, disbelief written all over his face. "Why is it impossible? I was there that day. I witnessed it with my own eyes. Thinking about it now, it's still vivid in my mind, engraved in my soul." Han Sanha said, "Did you know that some of the enemy's soldiers were slashed dozens of times, lying on the ground motionless? They were actually waiting for Dongshuan soldiers to pass by before they pounced on them, biting their targets' throats with the last bit of their strength. When the corpses were collected, more than 30 soldiers died in vain because of this. Do you know, after that battle, only about 200 of Dongshuan's 76,300 people were lightly injured? The rest of them were basically unscathed. No, I should say that among those who survived, there wasn't a single one who was heavily injured." Zhang Ge was a general who knew his soldiers well, understanding the deeper meaning of Han Sanha's words at once. His face paled at once. What a cruel battle that had been. Not even a single one was lightly injured. Not a single one was heavily injured. Those who were slightly injured were all dead. That battle was Shangguan Lingxiao's last battle. It was also the last battle of the Shangguan family of generals. It was also the last time this old man and the Shangguan family of generals will fight. Han Sanha sucked in a deep breath. Since then, this old man's respect for the Shangguan family of generals has exceeded that of anyone else. I don't even want to meet any heirs of the Shangguan family of generals anymore. He turned to look at Zhang Ge. Zhang Ge, what you're going to face tomorrow might very well be another Shangguan Lingxiao. Fu Baogua is even stronger and more fearless than Shangguan Lingxiao was back then. Most importantly, the total number of troops under him is 5 times more than Shangguan Lingxiao's. Also, the morale boost before us has greatly surpassed Shangguan Lingxiao's. Against such morale, no matter how many casualties there are, it won't weaken. Unless the other side is completely wiped out, there's no chance of victory. There seemed to be a ball of fire burning in Han Sanha's eyes. Lastly, if you win, you'll never forget Fu Baogua for a moment in your entire life. He'll become the most important person in your life. If you lose, Han Sanha closed his eyes, then it'll be eternal damnation. Are you ready? Zhang Ge felt his heart tremble as a sharp glint shot out from his eyes. I'm ready. If he, who had 1,000,000 men under his command, were to be defeated by Fu Baogua's 100,000 men, there would be no need for eternal damnation. He could just cut his own throat. What was the point of living? As a general, there has to be a battle that he has to face in his life, a battle that he has to overcome. Only by going through such a battle can he truly ascend to the position of a peerless marshal. Han Sanha said faintly, "This is your chance, and also your catastrophe." The singing on the other side did not stop. Not only did it not stop, it grew louder and more intense. In spite of this, the sharpness in Zhang Ji's gaze grew sharper. He sucked in a deep breath and said, "Teacher, don't worry. Tomorrow, I will definitely win this battle." Han Sanha nodded. Then Zhang Ge asked humbly, "Teacher, what strategy do you think I should adopt tomorrow?" Han Sanha narrowed his eyes and said faintly, "I can help you make decisions for all the battles in the past. However, I can't do that for tomorrow's battle. All of my suggestions, regardless of the pros and cons, will hinder you." Han Sanha said slowly, "I only have one last thing to tell you." Zhang Ge said sternly, "Please speak, teacher. This disciple will learn." Chapter 508. Han Sanha had gone back to rest for more than 2 hours. Zhang Ge was still at the top of the mountain, deep in thought. Determination to die. Determination to die. Zhang Ji's gaze grew brighter and more resolute. Fu Baogua asked. Has old Marshall's carriage left? It's been 4 hours since it left the base. Good. Has young Master Yin left? I didn't see him. He should have left with old Marshall. Good. That's great. Fu Baogua heaved a long sigh of relief. This Marshall can then be free of worries and fight to the death with all my might. Yin Yang took advantage of the dark night and sprinted like a wisp of smoke towards Tianxian Cliff at full speed. The Temple of the Nine Supremes stood at the highest point of Tianxian Cliff. It was the destination of Yin Yang's trip. I'm sorry, brothers. I have to take this step after all. I can't afford to hesitate when it's a matter of life and death. Yin Yang stood alone before the Temple of the Nine Supremes in the dark of the night. The long-awaited Temple of the Nine Supremes was right before his eyes. The majestic Yutong, the mighty Nine Supremes. Just the 8 words at the door made Yin Yang stop and stare at them for a long time. It was precisely these 8 words that had created countless massacres and blood debts. After a moment's pause, he slowly stepped into the place he had not visited for a long time. Standing alone in the middle of the hall, Yin Yang was at a loss as he stared at the Nine Supremes' silent statues. At this moment, it was as if he had become one of the 9 statues and no longer belonged to this world. If there's no other choice, I really don't want to use your powers, Yin Yang murmured. This younger brother has really gone to the end of the line. No matter how reluctant I am, no matter how indignant I am, everything that is happening right now is not what my brothers would like to see. If Yutong were to fall just like this young brother would be too ashamed to meet my brothers in the afterlife, so. Other than Yin Yang, there was probably no one else in this world who did not know that Tianxian Cliff was hiding a huge secret about the Nine Supremes. During the battle at Tianxian Cliff, the spiritual restraining formation had sealed all of the Nine Supremes' energy within their physical bodies, rendering them unable to use any of it. It was also after that battle that the Nine Supremes had fallen. It could be said to be Yutong's greatest regret in the last 100 years. The Nine Supremes were annihilated. However, it was also because of the spiritual restraining formation that the Nine Supremes' power did not dissipate even in death, being sealed within the boundaries of Tianxian Cliff. Other than the residents of Nine Supremes, the force belonged to heaven and earth. Even though the original owner had died, the force was sealed here and had not weakened at all. Even if a man dies, his strength lives on. That was because the power of these 9 attributes originally belonged to the vast sky and the earth. It was only because of a special method like the spirit controlling array that it was temporarily sealed. However, it was also because of this that this secret had been hidden in this place for a long time. If no one came to draw it, then perhaps after a very long time, this energy would gradually dissipate bit by bit, gradually vanish, and once again transform into the spiritual energy of the world. To be able to draw upon the 9 supreme spiritual power, one must possess the same cultivation method. Other than that, even if the person's cultivation base was astounding, there was nothing that could be done. In spite of this, perhaps heaven and earth were fated to be mysterious and mysterious. One of the 9 supremes had survived. Supreme Cloud, one of the 9 supremes, had come and personally activated this force. As long as he was willing, he could draw upon it effortlessly. Yin Yang had known about the existence of this force since a long time ago. Since the day he returned to the residence of 9 supremes for the first time, he had sensed another place where the 9 supremes' spiritual power gathered in this world. As long as Yin Yang arrived there, he could use the massive amount of spiritual power to elevate himself tremendously. However, Yin Yang had never drawn upon the power of this place. He did not even have the thought of doing so. He had been preserving this spiritual power. Even the last time, he would rather destroy his own body to cultivate the power of wind and fire with all his might than use this force. There was no other reason other than this was the last bit of power his brothers had left in this world. It was also an irrefutable proof that his brothers were still alive. If this force were to be used, there might really be nothing left. There would be no more traces of the other 9 supremes in this world. By then today, however, Yin Yang felt that he had been forced into a dead end. If he did not use this force, Yutong would definitely lose. The entire country would be under Dongxuan's iron hooves. The people would be plunged into misery. The nation would be annihilated. The land of Yutong was the land that he and his brothers had protected for their entire lives. How could they watch it be destroyed like this? Yun Yang knelt down silently and knocked his head hard on the ground. When he stood up, his forehead was covered in blood. Brothers, Xiaojiu is useless, please forgive me. It was midnight. When Dongxian had yet to make a move, Yutong had actually made the first move, taking the initiative to attack. Yutong's warriors were dressed neatly. It was not that the soldiers did not want to clean themselves, but it was because there were rarely any soldiers who did not have blood stains on them throughout the battle. Their armor and clothing were still intact, but even if there were blood stains on them, even if their clothes were tattered, they still tried their best to tidy themselves up. The torn areas were mended as best as they could, their belts were tied tightly, and their pants were tied neatly. They looked indescribably neat and tidy. They set off in neat rows, their armors bright and clean. Even their helmets were immaculately polished. Their faces were also the part that was uniformly clean. Everyone's faces were washed, and many of the soldiers had even washed their hair. It was as if what they were about to face was not a battle to the death, but an important person. Troops after troops came out from the mountains, the forest, and the campsite, lining up on the plains in front of the mountain. Yutong's soldiers marched and lined up, singing in unison. Looking afar, Yutong's soldiers did not look like a troop that was going to participate in the final battle. Instead, they looked like a ceremonial troop that had come to attend a banquet. The commanders of each troop stood at the front of the formation with their chests puffed up high. All the constructions that Fu Baogua had built during this period of time had long been destroyed. There was nothing left to defend. What was left of Yutong now was only flesh and blood. There was only life left. Then, let us use our lives and blood to build another fortress of resilience that belongs only to Yutong. The trombones sounded passionately. The uniform clopping of hooves could be heard with a rhythm that sent chills down one's spine. Troop after troop of steel cavalry appeared, slowly approaching the left side of the battlefield from the left. Troop after troop of serving troop appeared, approaching the right side of the battlefield from the right. The atmosphere was unusually solemn. The entire battlefield was solemn. My friend has helped me contact Peking Union Medical College Hospital. Line up tomorrow, be hospitalized the day after, and undergo surgery on Monday or Tuesday. Chapter 509. Other than the people, there were also the cavalry's war horses that came out in formation. For some reason, the war horses that were usually cheerful seemed to feel the solemn atmosphere today. Even when they were in the midst of such a loud commotion, the war horses were unusually tame. Amidst the low but passionate singing, all of Yutong's troops, be it infantry or cavalry, went into a conical formation. It was a triangular conical formation. The only purpose of such a formation was to attack. It was a formation that could not defend and only attack. It was a formation that would only be used when facing an enemy that was a few times larger than one's own. At the same time, it was the most extreme and most decisive formation. Among the steel horsemen, 12 youngsters were exceptionally eye-catching. They were also lined up neatly in a row. There was not the slightest bit of hesitation or confusion on their young faces, only determination. These youths were the children from the small valley, where Yin Yang had been recuperating the other day. All of them were there, not a single one missing. Shangguan Lingxiu, Qiu Jianhan, and Fu Baogua had solemnly told them to take good care of them and protect them as much as possible. In fact, they were included in the troop that was retreating this time. But when they left, even the steel cavalry's leader had asked them to retreat, repeatedly stating that they were Yutong's future hope. It was not cowardice to retreat now, nor was it cowardice. However, no matter how much they tried to persuade them, the 12 youths refused to leave. Since we're men, we should fight for the country. This is a time of crisis for the country. If we valued our lives, we wouldn't have come. We're here to kill the enemy and serve the country, not to be taken care of. If you must chase us away, we'll form our own team and charge the formation ourselves. We won't leave. We've decided to stay here and die here." The 12 youths spoke in unison, their words sonorous and sonorous. Finally, it was Wang Dinghua who made the final decision. "They're all good men. Let them stay. Good men and good children." Although there was only a difference of one word, the meaning was as different as heaven and earth. All the men in the military understood the meaning of these words. Towards these few youths, they instantly became more friendly. Previously, they had taken care of and cared for these youths, and even felt a little jealous. A group of half-grown children. What did they know about fighting on the battlefield? Didn't they know that it was a matter of life and death? They had wasted so many good horses, and they even needed someone to take care of them. Leaving was the right thing to do. But now, there was only the camaraderie of fellow soldiers, enough to entrust his back to the greatest trust. Now, with the 12 youths accompanying the team to battle, just from their appearance alone, they were already qualified to be Iron Cavalry. There was not the slightest difference between them and their comrades. They were also prepared to die, ready to fight to the death. They were qualified Yutong soldiers as well, not letting down Yutong's military might. Fu Baogua had changed into a rare set of golden armor and appeared at the center of the army. Perhaps it was heaven's will that the heavens were happy to see Yutong's successful battle, as the snow that had been falling for days finally stopped. Under the sunlight that had not shone for a long time, Fu Baogua's golden helmet and armor shimmered like a deity, his aura unparalleled. "War drums!" Fu Baogua waved his hand and ordered calmly. "Dong!" The dull sound of a drum suddenly rang out, spreading far and wide. Then, dong, dong, dong. Another 3 drumbeats rang out. Dong, 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 dong. It was only then that the continuous beating of the war drums rang out continuously. The drum beats were like a dull pounding on one's heart, causing the blood in one's chest to heat up and surge along with the drum beats until it boiled. As the drum beats grew louder and louder, each of Yutong's soldiers' faces seemed to glow. They were still motionless, but their hands that were gripping their weapons tightened gradually, their grip on the weapons becoming steadier. Although all the war horses were unusually quiet and motionless, each of them had their ears perked up, their muscles tensed up. They did not even make the subconscious movement of wagging their tails. The only movement they made was to keep their eyes forward, waiting for their master's order, before they turned into an arrow that had left the bow and headed for the final battlefield. On the opposite side, the shadow cavalry surged forward slowly like a tidal wave. Dongshuan soldiers' sabers and spears shone brightly, their murderous aura soaring to the sky. Obviously, Zhang Ge had also adopted the most extreme and forceful method to face the enemy head-on. "If you want to court death, I shall fulfill your wish. I shall use my strongest combat power, my comprehensive combat power that far surpasses yours, to crush your final counterattack. This is also the greatest respect I can give to my opponent. Perhaps, this was the greatest respect that could ever be given in this world." Dong dong dong. Drumbeats rang out from Dongshuan's side as well. Almost at the same time, a loud neigh of a warhorse rang out from Dongshuan's formation, followed by the sound of galloping hooves. A majestic white horse galloped out. The person sitting on the horse was clad in golden armor like Fu Baogua, looking majestic. He galloped all the way to the front of the 2 armies and suddenly hollered, "Fu Baogua!" The person was Dongshuan's temporary marshal Zhang Ge. He had actually come to the front of the formation personally. On the other side, Fu Baogua sat on the horse's back, his hawk-like gaze fixed on Zhang Ge, but he did not answer. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of people from both sides, Zhang Ge spoke loudly, "Fu Baogua, you and I have been fighting until now. Although we have our own standpoints, fighting to the death for our respective masters, this battlefield is also where the greatest glory lies. You and I know very well that today is the last battle between both sides. You and I both know that today is the last battle between the 2 sides. Zhang Ge has specially come here to pay his respects to General Fu, and to send him off." Then Zhang Ge waved his hand and hollered, "Wine!" 2 riders came out from Dongshuan's formation to deliver the wine pouch. Zhang Ge took the wine pouch and took out a wine cup. He personally filled the cup and raised his hand. "Marshal Fu, Regardless of who wins or loses this battle, it is still a matter for the future. However, it is the duty of a soldier to fight to the death on the battlefield. Let me give you a toast, and a toast to myself as well. If I die at the end of this battle, I have no complaints. If I die, please, if there's a next life, let's be a bosom friend. As he finished, Zhang Ge tipped his head back and drained the wine in his hand. Zhang Ge finished the 3 goblets in a row and wiped his mouth, speaking loudly again. I know you're not willing to come out and drink this goblet with me, so I'll drink it myself. These 3 goblets of wine before this life and death battle are delightful, delightful. Ha ha ha. Coming out like this and toasting in such a manner, it showed the true nature of a soldier who was fearless of life and death. It also showed his magnanimity. Whether Zhang Jiyi's move was sincere or not, it was a beautiful move. There was another result to this, or rather, the biggest goal of Zhang Jiyi's move was to weaken Yutong's already brimming morale as much as possible, and at the same time, boost Dongxuan's morale with the confidence that they would win this battle. A fleeting glint of glee flashed across Zhang Jiyi's eyes. Han Sanha watched from afar and could not help sighing. Both sides were on opposite ends of the spectrum. What was the point of playing these little tricks now that they had come to this juncture? Did you think Fu Baoguo would let you off easy? Playing tricks in front of an expert like this would only be a futile effort, one that might even bring about one's own destruction. The reality was exactly as Han Sanha had predicted. On Yutong's side, Fu Baoguo's voice boomed like thunder. Zhang Ge, this marshal has no interest in the 3 goblets of wine that you've come to offer. I don't agree with what you said just now at all. I have a few words in my heart that I have to say. Zhang Ge said, please speak, Marshal Fu. What he wanted to do, and what he wanted to say just now had all been said and done smoothly. Fu Baoguo had not interrupted him at all. Now that Fu Baoguo wanted to speak, if he were to interrupt him, he would appear to lack the demeanor of a general and shatter the confident atmosphere of victory that he had just built. At the very least, the effect would be greatly reduced. Fu Baoguo guffawed. Zhang Ge, you said just now that we each have our standpoints. We each serve our respective masters, and we have no choice but to fight. I don't deny the first half of this. We do indeed serve our respective masters and standpoints. However, the latter part, we have no choice but to fight, I find it hard to agree with it. Chapter 510. Fu Baoguo's voice was thick and strong, echoing above the battlefield. Who are you people? What is your purpose in invading Yutong? To put it simply, you are invaders who have come to invade Yutong's great land. We, the soldiers who guard the border, are passively defending. We are the ones who have no choice but to fight. Only we have the right to use the words no choice but to fight. What right do you invaders have to say that you have no choice but to fight? As the saying goes, justice is in the hearts of the people. There is no distinction between right and wrong. What do you say that you have no choice but to fight is nonsense? Or perhaps a great joke. It's better that you hide quickly and don't make others laugh at you. Fu Baoguo's words were sonorous, his voice like a thunderclap as he spoke vehemently. You said that dying on the battlefield is the duty of a soldier. This at its core is understandable, but what do you all die on the battlefield for? For glory and wealth. But we die on the battlefield to protect our homes and defend our country against the invaders. Speaking of which, you are still not worthy of mentioning the word soldier's duty. The so-called greatest glory has nothing to do with you. Zhang Jiyi's expression changed. You also said that if you die on the battlefield, you have no complaints. If I die on the battlefield, I hope that we can be bosom friends in our next life. Fu Baoguo sneered. Let me give you a piece of advice. Keep your words to yourself and stop dreaming. Even if we die on the battlefield, even if there is a next life, we will never be bosom friends with you, the leader of the invaders. Be it life or death, be it this life or the next, you invaders will always be our greatest enemy. If there is a next life, I will only continue to enlist in the army and climb up the ranks to become the marshal again. I will fight you all on the battlefield again, to fight to the death. We Yutong soldiers have never been afraid of battle, but we have never been willing to initiate a war. Fu Baoguo said loudly. If you had not come, Many of us would not have enlisted in the army. If you had not come, many of us would have preferred to stay at home, to live with our wives and children, to farm and cultivate, to grow old together, to unite with our neighbors, to be filial to the elderly, to teach our children. We were willing to be mediocre for the rest of our lives, willing to die of old age in the forest, unknown but peaceful and happy. But you have come, you invaders have come. We have no choice but to fight. If we don't fight, our homes will be destroyed. Our fathers, mothers, wives, and children will be killed. All of us will be enslaved. That's why we are standing here, fighting against you invaders. Now, in order to raise your morale, you actually say such shameless words. What is the greatest honor of a soldier? Coming from your mouth, it will only tarnish the duty of a soldier. Dongxian is not worthy of mentioning the so-called highest honor of a soldier. At this time and place, only we, the Yutong army, deserve to have it. This is ours. Fu Baogua hollered. Yutong's 100,000-strong army was flushed with agitation, feeling like their hearts were about to explode from the gushing blood. They could not help shouting in unison, "Ours!" The orderly and resolute voices were like thunder in the clear sky, shaking the 9 heavens. Zhang Jiyi's expression changed, and his pupils contracted rapidly. At this moment he realized that he had failed. Not only did Yutong's morale, which had just been knocked down, recover after Fu Baogua's words, it was even several times stronger than before. On the other hand, many of his men had their heads lowered, shame that came from the bottom of their hearts on their faces. Zhang Gu could not help groaning inwardly. He had not expected Fu Baogua to not only be a cut above the rest in the art of war and strategy, but also to be so eloquent. His tongue was as sharp as a knife, and his words were sharp enough to draw blood. Zhang Gu was afraid that he had really outsmarted himself this time. Just as he was about to interrupt Fu Baogua, he heard Fu Baogua roar fiercely again. "There's only one sentence in your long speech that's right. You said that I'm not willing to come out and drink these 3 goblets of wine with you. You're right. I'm not willing. This Fu also drinks, but this Fu only drinks with friends, brothers, and fellow comrades. However, I, Fu Baogua, will never drink with an invader. Are you worthy to drink with me?" Fu Baogua guffawed, his voice like thunder. "Who do you think you are? You're only an invader who has come to invade my land, to invade my home, to kill my brothers, to maim my comrades. How dare you dream of drinking with me? Do you think you're worthy?" Pfft! Zhang Gu was trembling with rage when he heard him hollering, "Fu Baogua." Fu Baogua ignored him and recited, "The hearts of Yutong's warriors, the bones of steel to fight against the nation. Today, when the nation is in danger, we won't hesitate to die." He hollered, "Beat the drums. Sound the bugles. Attack." The majestic war drums rang with Fu Baogua's command. The bleak and desolate bugles seemed to have blown open the gates of hell as a boundless, menacing aura filled the air and engulfed the heaven and earth. Yutong's warriors, whose blood was already boiling to its boiling point, roared in unison, "Kill!" The sound of horse hooves rumbled like rolling thunder. There were 8 squads of cavalrymen, each of them holding a huge flag high, as they charged forward like a raging dragon clearing a path. Wang Dinghua was in the center of the formation as he hollered, "The steel cavalry is here. Who dares to invade our land?" Behind him, tens of thousands of steel cavalry responded in unison, "The steel cavalry is here. Who dares to invade our land?" Tens of thousands of people responded in unison, as if a hole had suddenly collapsed in the clear sky. "Serving troop. Since we've enlisted, we shall serve our country with loyalty. Blood shall be shed on the battlefield at the border. We shall not let down our youth. Today, we shall serve our country with our lives. Kill." 100,000 soldiers charged forward like a tsunami, determined to fight to the death. Their target was Dongshuan's base. Their aura was unparalleled as they looked down on the world. The military flag fluttered in the wind. Fu Baogua stood at the back of Yutong's army, standing tall like a mountain, his aura imposing. His eyes were glued to the flag that was about to charge into the enemy's base, and was gradually blurring, as if he was looking at his next life. He stood tall like a mountain, steady like an abyss, but his vision was already blurry. On the opposite side, The shadow cavalry had already moved out. Like a black wave, they surged from the horizon and rolled forward, blanketing the sky and earth. In an instant, they had already covered half of the battlefield, blocking their path. Extremes against extremes, the two armies had launched into a life-and-death battle the moment they came into contact. From this moment on, the final battle of Yutong's eastern front line had begun. Good brother, good man, we shall continue to fight together in our next life. I, Fu Baogua, shall still be your marshal. Fu Baogua squeezed his warhorse with both legs and pointed the sword in his hand forward. Just as he was about to urge his horse forward with a roar, his body, which was already charging forward, suddenly jerked and stiffened, inexplicably stopping its charge. At the same time, his eyes revealed a peculiar look of disbelief. Han Sanha, who had been guarding the rear, felt it too. He stood up abruptly, his face ashen and unusually grim. It was at this moment that the whistling wind in the air suddenly changed direction from the northern wind that was in accordance with the weather, turning into a strong western wind. At this moment, the changes in the weather were sudden and without the slightest sign, and it even went against convention. Moreover, it was intense to the point it was unbelievable. The sudden, violent western wind swept the ground, bringing with it a cloud of dust and sand as it hurled towards the east. Yes, it was hurled over. At this very moment, the wind swept the sand and dust over. The violent wind howled, hissing in the air. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into an even more powerful hurricane. Gradually, it was no longer limited to sweeping the sand and dust, but it had also swept up the dust, snow, and ice on the ground. For a moment, the wind was like a hidden weapon descending from the sky, crashing towards Dongshuan's army, along with the wind's momentum. At the same time, the wind and clouds gathered in the sky, gathering above the battlefield as if they had heard the order to assemble. In just a moment the clouds were already densely packed, piling up into a thick layer. Above the thick layers of clouds, flashes of lightning could be seen from time to time. It was obvious that a large amount of lightning was brewing above the clouds. After a few breaths, the rumbling of thunder reverberated in the sky. The next moment, with a thunderous crack, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky. It was unknown if it was a coincidence, or if it was the will of the heavens, but it exploded right in the middle of Dongshuan's shadow cavalry. Chapter 511. His recovery was almost complete. In the past few days, he would often sit in front of the computer. In the beginning, he would feel sore and tear up after looking at it for more than 10 minutes. Now he could basically stay in front of the computer for 40 to 50 minutes before his eyes started to feel sore. Of course, he did not just look at the screen these few days. Naturally, he would also open a document and type a few words. He had rested for 3 to 4 days after his surgery. At that time, he really did not dare to look at it. Later on, he started to write a few hundred to 1,000 words intermittently every day. Today he actually wrote 2,000 words in one go. Then, his eyes could not take it anymore, and he started to tear up. He wrote so few words every day that he could not update normally. But looking at the situation, it would only be 3 to 4 days before he completely recovered. Therefore, he decided to start updating next Monday the 29th. With the 5,000 to 6,000 words that he had written intermittently over the past few days as a foundation, he should not be too tired in the beginning. Therefore, there was no need for everyone to worry. After not updating for so long, this was the first time in his 10 years of professional life that he felt as if something was missing in his life. He was finally coming back. Thank you for your concern. This time, he was very proud of himself. Although he did not update for nearly 20 days, he basically did not fall behind in his monthly votes. Every time he saw it, he felt a warm feeling in his heart. How could he bear to leave when all of you are so cute? See you on Monday afternoon. Chapter 512. If Yutong's eastern frontline's charge was said to be the prelude to this extreme war, Then this lightning strike was also the prelude to heaven's might. After the first lightning strike, thick bolts of lightning fell from the sky and landed within Dongxuan's formation. How could the power of heaven and earth be resisted by humans? Men screamed and horses neighed. It was a tragic sight. The power of heaven and earth was unstoppable. Dongxuan's misfortune continued as they endured the natural disaster. Not long after the countless bolts of lightning struck, a charred smell began to spread from the ground. Perhaps it was a dozen breaths later, or perhaps it was only the very next moment. With a deafening explosion, streaks of fire dragons appeared out of thin air and rose abruptly, engulfing the entire Dongxian camp in the blink of an eye. In just the blink of an eye, the dozens of miles of Dongxuan's camp had turned into a sea of fire. The lightning and fire appeared at the same time, their power unstoppable. What was worse was that it was reasonable to say that the ground fire had appeared out of nowhere, due to the west wind, burning Dongxuan's base. It was understandable and barely acceptable. But why did the lightning strike from the sky seem to have eyes of its own? It only targeted Dongxuan's soldiers, and not a single Yutong soldier perished under the boundless lightning? This was a little too far-fetched. Even a novel would not dare to write something like this. Unfortunately, there was still more to come. With another deafening boom, a huge crack appeared on the ground closer to Dongxuan's formation. It was like the gates of hell had suddenly opened. Countless Dongxian soldiers fell into the crack, caught off guard. Water that came out of nowhere poured in. It was obvious that many of the soldiers who had fallen into the crack were no longer spared. What happened next was the few peaks where Dongxian had set up camp. They collapsed without warning. For a moment, the ground was like a pot of boiling water, constantly churning and tumbling. Both men and horses could not stand and fell. It was a true earth dragon turning over. And it was not just one earth dragon, but a few of them at the same time. How could the commotion be insignificant? As far as the eye could see, the ground within a 100-mile radius was rumbling and rumbling. Blood-curdling screams and wails filled the air. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were all screaming in despair. It was the hopeless wail of people on the brink of death. However, the change was not over yet. Streaks of crimson patterns weaved into a huge net in the air and fell with a swoosh. All the Dongxian soldiers who were shrouded in crimson howled in agony without exception. Thin streaks of blood shot out from the pores on their bodies as they died instantly. There were flashes of golden light. The weapons in the hands of countless Dongxian soldiers were sheathed after the flash of golden light. When they landed on their opponents, they would at most injure their tendons and bones. It was difficult to inflict further damage. The difficulty of taking their opponent's life had increased exponentially. All the sabers, swords, spears, and spears had turned into burning sticks made of scrap metal at this moment. These were the signs of Dongxian suffering from natural and earthly disasters, while Yutong was also affected by the phenomenon. Streaks of green light could be seen everywhere in Yutong's army. Yutong's soldiers who were touched by the green light were instantly invigorated. Even those who had been severely injured. Most of their injuries were healed, and they were brimming with energy, as if they had been resurrected on the spot, and were ready to fight again. As far as the eye could see, the sky was covered in layers of clouds that contained lightning and thunder. On the ground, the wind was fueling the fire, while the fire bore the might of the wind. It had long turned Dongxuan's orderly troops into a pot of porridge. A pot of mushy porridge. Zhang Ge hollered with all his might, trying his best to recall the army and stabilize their footing. However, the frequent natural and earthly disasters had long surpassed the limits of human control. How could they possibly regroup? By then, Dongxuan's morale had completely collapsed. The wind blew. Fire. Earth dragon. Lightning. Lightning. Water. Blood. Wood. Everything was so familiar. There was only one possibility for such a familiar phenomenon to attack Dongxian, but help Yutong. Perhaps it was an explanation. The 9 Supremes. Indeed, the clouds in the sky tumbled violently before 8 huge words appeared. Everyone on the battlefield could see it clearly. It was clear to them. The mighty Yutong, the mighty 9 Supremes. Han Sanhe closed his eyes dejectedly. It was over. The situation that he feared the most had finally happened. Along the way, he had let Zhang Ge be in charge of the main battle, other than training Zhang Ge, so that he as his successor could claim all the military merits and obtain the ultimate achievement of defeating Yutong's top young prodigy. There was another concern. Once the 9 Supremes appeared, there would be room to turn things around with him as the backup. However, when the Fortress of Resilience was breached, Supreme Cloud had not appeared. When Qiu Jianhan was on the brink of death and Yutong's elites were trapped, Supreme Cloud had still not appeared. Even when the army had been suppressing Yutong's army, Supreme Cloud had not appeared until now. The outcome was almost certain. Although Han Sanha's teachings to Zhang Ge were filled with warning, and he was even a little pessimistic about the outcome of the battle, Han Sanha had already come to a conclusion in his heart. Zhang Ge against Fu Baogua. No matter how brutal the battle was, no matter how many casualties Dong Xian had to pay, this battle would still be won. Based on the current situation, it could be confirmed that Supreme Cloud had indeed been killed. At the very least, he was trapped. Otherwise, it was impossible for him not to appear when Yutong was on the brink of annihilation. He was not fated to participate in this battle. Then everything was simple. No matter how glorious the final outcome of this battle was, only death awaited him when he returned. In that case, it would be better to hand the great merit to Zhang Ji's hands and hasten his rise to fame, grooming the next generation of invincible marshals for Dong Xian. Although the consequences for Han Sanha were unavoidable, Dong Xian still had his successor, Zhang Ge, alive and well. His family, children, and descendants would not be too miserable no matter what. The military would always back him up. In spite of this, just as Han Sanha let down his guard and quietly observed the aftermath of the battle, it was also the most unexpected moment. The power of the 9 Supremes' manifestation powers had appeared once again. Furthermore, this time, it wasn't like the last few times, where there were only 2 or 3 phenomena that appeared. This time, it was like the 9 Supremes' manifestation powers had appeared at the same time to wreak havoc on the battlefield. Almost immediately, all of Dongshuan's troops were dumbfounded. How is this possible? How is this possible? Even if Supreme Cloud was not dead, even if he had come, he should not have been able to create such a terrifying outcome. The manifestations appeared before their eyes, the lightning and fire, the mountains and rivers changing color, the wind and clouds surging, the web of blood, metal, and wind. Everything was proof that this was not something that could be done by one person. It was obvious that the 9 Supremes were not dead. Not even one of them had died. Moreover, all of them had appeared together. This was how such a situation could be created. Did the 8 words in the sky prove this point, declaring that the 9 Supremes were not dead and had made a comeback at this moment? How was this possible? Dongshuan's soldiers were unwilling to believe that this was true, but everything that they had endured was proof that this was the truth. The 9 Supremes had arrived at the same time, and the manifestation of the 9 manifestations. How could there be anyone in this world who could resist them? They were already on the brink of collapse. Even if they were to continue fighting, they would only be sacrificing a few lives for nothing. At this point, it was absolutely impossible to turn the tide of the battle. Defeat was inevitable. Sound the gong, retreat. Han Sanha closed his eyes helplessly and waved his hand. At this moment, all hope was lost. Only those who had personally experienced the power of the 9 Supremes and the 9 manifestations could truly understand its power. Back then, the Empire of Diyuan at the southern border had also had the upper hand in terms of military strength, but it could not withstand the combined might of the manifestation powers. It had crumbled with a single touch. Now, the facts had proven that Dongxian was no exception to the rule. The power of the 9 Supremes was indeed the ultimate weapon of war in this world. It was unparalleled. Unlike Dongshuan's despair, Yutong's military formation was the complete opposite. Yutong's warriors could not help but cheer deafeningly at this familiar scene that they had not seen for a long time, especially the sudden sense of bliss. 9 Supremes Lords! 9 Supremes Lords! Deafening cheers rang throughout the battlefield almost instantly. All of Yutong's warriors were guffawing like they had been injected with adrenaline, charging forward with unstoppable momentum. Kill! The 9 Supremes Lords are here. Yutong is saved. We're saved. This is the last battle, but it's Dongxuan's last battle. Yes, 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 victory belongs to us. Kill these invaders. Many of the veterans were so moved that tears streamed down their cheeks. Just when they had resigned themselves to their fate and were ready to fight to the death, the 9 Supremes Lords had finally appeared. Fu Baogua, who had just snapped back to reality and was charging forward, was almost frozen from the ecstasy on his face. Only hot tears were streaming down his cheeks. After some time, he suddenly guffawed, tears still rolling down his cheeks as he roared in a hoarse voice. Mighty Yutong! Mighty 9 Supremes! Mighty Yutong, mighty 9 Supremes! Countless people were shouting the slogan with all their might, almost coughing blood from their throats. It was as if they could not vent the extreme happiness and excitement in their hearts if they did not shout like that. Yutong's morale was unstoppable, like a ferocious tiger descending the mountain. Dongxuan's military was dispirited, their morale plunging to freezing point. There was no longer any will to fight. Even the Shadow Cavalry, who was known for their military discipline and was known as the most elite, was in a state of disarray, unable to retaliate. Facing the 9 Supremes at the same time, who would dare say they could resist? That was the true power of heaven and earth. It was not something that a human could fight against. Chapter 513. Fortunately, Han Sanha's signal rang out haphazardly. After a while, it finally became a unified command, bringing some direction to the disorderly morale of the army. Dongxuan's troops turned around and ran back with all their might, retreating like a receding tide. At this point, they could only think of running, to leave the range of the heaven and earth's might as soon as possible. In spite of this, Yutong's morale was high. Chase. Kill. Their only thought was to charge and kill as they gave chase. Zhang Ge still did not want to retreat. The glory of 1,000 years was within his grasp, within his reach. He was about to secure the absolute position of the continent's hegemon. Yet, such a fatal turn of events had happened at this crucial moment. Zhang Ji's head was buzzing. Don't retreat. We have the advantage in numbers. Hold on, hold on. Zhang Ji's eyes were bloodshot. He drew his sword and killed a few of the defeated soldiers personally, trying to control the situation. However, with his strength alone, how could he stop the tens of thousands of soldiers who had already collapsed? Even if he were to kill without stopping, how many people could he kill? The truth was cruel. Not only could Zhang Ge not stop the fleeing soldiers, he was instead surrounded by them, retreating involuntarily. When he came to his senses, he had already retreated all the way out of the fortress of resilience. Where's teacher? Where's teacher? Zhang Ge shouted in a frenzy, looking flustered. In such a critical moment, the only person he could think of was his omnipotent teacher, the god of war, Han Sanha. It was a pity. The defeated army was like a landslide. Even if Han Sanha were to step forward personally, he could not change the situation. No matter how elite the troop was, once the morale of the army collapsed, and they retreated like this, even if a real deity descended from heaven, he would be helpless, let alone the continent's god of war. Under such circumstances, Han Sanha could gather the defeated soldiers and run in one direction. It was already a feat worthy of a peerless marshal. Yutong's warriors were like ferocious tigers that had just been let out of their cage, chasing after the enemy bravely without letting up. They had been holding back for such a long time. Now was the time for revenge. If he didn't do his best to kill the enemy and take revenge now, when would he? Even a soldier with a broken leg would struggle to find a horse to ride, and use all his strength to chase after the enemy. Avenge our fallen brothers. Li Erniu, did you see that? The 9 Supremes Lords are here. We've won, we've avenged you. Boss Chi, the spirits in the netherworld must be overjoyed. Revenge. Kill them all. Kill all these invaders. Yutong will not allow enemies to wreak havoc. Those who invade Yutong shall be killed, no matter how strong they are. Fu Baogua commanded the troops to give the order to pursue and kill them. Chase after them. Chase them until they're all dead. Honestly, Fu Baogua did not want to pursue her so thoroughly. Fu Baogua understood this better than anyone else. This was a great taboo for commanders and generals, and a great taboo for strategists. Although Dong Xian was defeated now, with Han Sanhe and Zhang Jiyi's abilities, it would not take long for them to rebuild their army, perhaps with just a place to settle down. Although the army was temporarily routed, it did not mean that it would be routed forever. If they were to be bitten back, it would cause a change in the favorable situation. In spite of this, Fu Baogua had to give chase now. He had already realized that something was not right with the situation. The Nine Supremes' power had only been unleashed once just now. The unstoppable force was unparalleled, but it seemed like each of them had only attacked once. After that, there had been no more movements. As if the Nine Supremes had stopped. This was not a situation that should have happened. Although the advantage of both sides had been reversed, Dongxuan's losses were still limited, and their foundation was still intact. As long as they cleaned up the defeated soldiers and regrouped, the situation would change once again. Therefore, the Nine Supremes should continue to unleash their manifestation powers to assist Yutong and secure their victory. Therefore, Fu Baogua immediately realized that the Nine Supremes' power would only have this one chance to attack. Could it be that something really happened? The Nine Supremes had not made a move previously because of some reason. Now that they were in a precarious situation, they were finally forced to make a move. But even if they did, it would be as far as they could go. If that was the case, then they could only continue chasing and fighting. They had to maximize the results of this battle as much as they could. They had to extend the time that Han Sanhe had the chance to catch his breath. If his guess was right, Yutong's disaster would still come once Han Sanhe had the time to catch his breath. The danger might even be greater than before. Yutong's troops' morale was at its peak now. It was time to push on. If they were to slow down, they would fall into a stage of exhaustion. If Dongxian were to retaliate, Yutong would suffer a great defeat immediately, and their combat power would be diminished due to the interference of various negative emotions. The final outcome would not even be as good as when the soldiers fought to their deaths. After all, it was difficult to have the thought of fighting for their lives now that there was hope. How could a person's emotions change drastically again and again? Especially now that the fortress of resilience was gone. With this natural defense line gone, it would take at least a year to rebuild it. At this moment, a deafening neigh could be heard as a red silhouette sprang up from Yutong's troop like a bolt of lightning. Riding on the red silhouette was a purple silhouette. The man and the horse were as one as they sped towards the direction where Dongxuan's retreating troop was at a breakneck speed. Han Sanhe, give me your life. Fu Baogua was shocked. Yin Yang, how could it be him? Why was he here? Had he not left with the old marshal and the others? What was going on? Before he could figure it out, the red silhouette had already sped away, vanishing from sight. Dongxuan's troops were still retreating, running back like the tide. Although Zhang Ge had killed many of the retreating soldiers in hopes of stabilizing the situation and stabilizing the troops' morale, it was a pity that human strength was insignificant before the apocalyptic force of heaven and earth. Not only was he unable to turn the tide, he was even swept away by the countless retreating soldiers. Fortunately, Zhang Ge was unable to stabilize the troops' morale, but Dongxian still had a stabilizing force. On the other side of Dongxuan's camp, a huge flag was erected. This flag looked extraordinary at first glance. Just the surface of the flag alone was about 10 times the size of an ordinary flag. It must be extraordinary. All the Dongxian soldiers who were retreating were charging forward with their heads lowered, hoping to be a step closer to safety and leave the area covered by the terrifying force of heaven as soon as possible. However, there were those who lifted their heads occasionally, and those who did would see the war flag that was more than 300 feet tall, appearing in the sky in front of them like a red cloud. Anyone who saw it would feel their heart calm down inexplicably. The God of War's flag. It was the God of War's flag, Han Sanhe's personal flag. The 8 golden words on the flag shone brilliantly. The strong wind blew the flag until it was as straight as a line, as if it was embedded in the air, detached from the world. 8 words were written on the flag. A sword light that chills the mountains and rivers. Han Sanha. The main reason why Dongxuan's soldiers were defeated was due to the sudden appearance of the force of heaven and earth. It was unstoppable and unstoppable, but a large part of it was due to the incompetence of the current leader. Zhang Ge could not win against Fu Baogua in terms of words at the beginning of the battle. Not only did he lose his morale, he had even lost his status. The troops' morale was no longer just restless, it was rather lethargic. If they could gain the upper hand in this battle and fight with the wind, it would be fine. However, now that the entire line had failed and they were completely routed, how could the troops' morale remain? Chapter 514. Dongxuan's soldiers did not trust Zhang Ge at all. Now that they were defeated, survival was their top priority. However, Han Sanha's appearance had given them hope. The war was dangerous, and they were at a disadvantage, but it would be better to gather by the continent's god of war's side. The title of the continent's god of war was not just for show. As the flag of the god of war fluttered in the wind, a series of bugles rumbled beneath the flag. On the other side, there were 5,000 Shadow Knights who had just formed into an army. Although they still looked a little disheveled, they had already formed a battle formation. Facing the hundreds of thousands of fleeing soldiers, they did not move an inch. They wanted to turn the tide and were ready to go. As time went on, the blare of the horns gradually merged into one, boosting the morale of the army. Among Dongxuan's men who had gathered, Han Sanha rode on a warhorse at the front, wearing a snow-white marten coat. His gaze was calm as he watched his troops flee in disarray, his expression unchanging. There was only one message being conveyed by the incessant blare of the horns. Return. Gather the troops. Fall into formation. The current quiet atmosphere restored Dongxuan's morale to all the routed soldiers who had witnessed the scene. After all, these troops were Dongxuan's elite troop, the cream of the crop. Dongxuan's cannon fodder, rabble, and aristocratic martial prowess that had invaded Yutong this time had been filled by Han Sanha to fill the gap of flesh and blood in front of the fortress of resilience. The remaining Dongxian soldiers were warriors who had gone through countless battles of steel and blood. Even if such an elite troop was in a state of defeat, due to some unusual factors, as long as there was something that could shock them, they would be able to recover swiftly. Han Sanha was the one who was able to shock them to their core. More and more soldiers stopped in their tracks, their initially fearful gazes regaining their clarity after a momentary flicker. One by one, they stepped forward and joined Dongxuan's troop, getting into formation. Some of the lower-ranking officers had even begun to reorganize their troops. 5th Battalion, 7th Squad, 3rd Column. Gather here. 3rd Battalion, 1st Column, 2nd Squad. Here. F***CK, hurry up. Gather. Stop running. Come and gather. The moment Han Sanha raised the flag of God of War and revealed himself so casually, he managed to quell the fear and panic of the million-strong army. More and more Dongxian soldiers began to line up behind Han Sanha. An awe-inspiring aura that belonged solely to soldier was brewing again. This was where Han Sanha's brilliance came from. He was well aware of his own strengths and weaknesses. It was true that he was known as the continent's god of war, but he was not a true immortal. Even if he had flashed the flag of God of War, it would have been futile. There was a 99% chance that he would follow in Zhang Ji's footsteps and be scattered by the routed army. That would have been a massive defeat, and there would be no turning back. Therefore, he took the first step and waited at the place where the army had retreated 100 miles, raising his military flag. Given the current situation, the routed army had to be given a buffer. It was only at such a time when the stamina of the routed army that had been running for their lives was almost depleted. Most importantly, the fear of the unknown force was almost numb to them, and they needed someone to rely on, a pillar of support. Only then could Han Sanha's sudden appearance achieve such a stunning effect. This logic sounded simple, But under such circumstances, there were at most 3 people in the entire continent who were able to stand out and forcefully stop the defeated army from falling to the ground. In the entire continent, there were at most 3 people who could do this. In order to achieve this, the commander-in-chief must have the ability to remain calm in the face of danger and have unparalleled prestige in the army. Neither of these 2 qualities could be lacking. It was truly a feat that could not be accomplished by ordinary people. Dongxuan's routed army surged like the tide. Looking from afar, Han Sanhe's side was like a pillar of support amidst the raging waves, a pillar of stability. The routed army was like a raging tide, but when it passed by Han Sanhe, the pillar of stability, it quickly turned from a torrent to a slow stream before it stopped and regained its momentum. It was nothing short of a miracle. This was what it meant to be able to turn the tide. Zhang Ge retreated with the routed army, almost coughing blood along the way. When they finally came close and slowed down, Zhang Ge still wanted to draw his sword to slash and suppress the routed army. But he realized that the speed at which the soldiers around him were fleeing had slowed to a crawl. Perhaps it should be said that they were no longer fleeing, but advancing slowly. Zhang Ge sucked in a deep breath and looked over. Once he saw the solemn military formation, tears fell from Zhang Jiyi's eyes. He choked, "Teacher." Han Sanhe remained silent and unmoving, his gaze calm as he waved his hand lightly. Zhang Ge felt his body brimming with energy as he strode over. In just a few steps, he had regained his composure. When he came to stand beside Han Sanhe, he was completely composed. Even the dejection of his defeat had vanished without a trace. Even if the sky were to fall, everything would be fine as long as his teacher was here. The continent's god of war was the only one who respected his teacher. With his teacher here, so what if the 9 supremes were to come together? Dust billowed from afar. Han Sanhe narrowed his eyes, looking at where the smoke was rising into the sky, and said faintly, "That's where the only chance to turn the tide of this battle lies. Zhang Ge, remember this. This is the last chance that I can teach you and allow you to learn from me." Zhang Ji's face was filled with sorrow. Yes, watch closely. There was no expression on Han Sanhe's face, only endless indifference. His gaze was distant as he looked into the distance. Fleeing is the most humiliating thing in a general's life, but it's something that can't be avoided. Once it happens, it's the worst-case scenario in a general's life. However, nothing is absolute in this world. Even when the crisis is right before your eyes and you're in a hopeless situation, there's still a chance to turn things around. As long as you don't panic and still have the prestige of stabilizing the army's morale, you can seize the opportunity to turn the tide of the battle. Even if it doesn't work out, you can still retreat in one piece and not suffer a crushing defeat. The current state of the battle has been reversed. The enemy has gained the upper hand, but it's not yet a victory. If the enemy's general is greedy for victory and doesn't know that he's going to lose, he's going to pursue us with all his might, causing his attack formation to fall into disarray. Then, we might still have a chance to turn the tide of the battle. Han Sanhe said faintly, "Let's see if Fu Baogua can still maintain his composure at such a time. If he can, his position as Tianquan's god of war will be secured, and we can retreat in one piece. On the other hand, if he can't, we'll charge back tonight." There's a huge disparity in our military strength. Even though our army has just been defeated, our combined combat power is still above Yutong's eastern troop. Zhang Ge answered humbly and seriously, "Yes. What I said isn't only for Fu Baogua. It's the same for anyone you're facing, any general. As a general, remaining calm in the face of danger is the demeanor of a great general, not wavering even in death." Han Sanhe's voice seemed to come from a faraway place as he said, "You must remember these words of mine. You can't forget them no matter what. You can't lose your composure. That's why I said that you've disappointed me this time." Han Sanhe said solemnly, "When the army was defeated, you, as the marshal, didn't flee first, but you didn't manage to stabilize the army's morale. You couldn't avoid being held hostage by the defeated army. After today's defeat, of course, you should follow the troops, but what you should do is to send your own bodyguards ahead of time with your marshal's flag. Go ahead and raise your marshal's flag on the road, that we must pass 60, or even 80 li away. You didn't react as a marshal. Along the way, I've only seen your indignation, your rage, your despair, your violence, and your murder. I didn't see your composure, your unruffled mind despite the defeat. Based on this alone, you're already far from Fu Baoguo's level. Han Sanha's gaze was distant. If you can't overcome the fear in your heart, you'll never be able to be a qualified marshal. I hope that the disappointment I feel today ends today. There won't be a next time, never. Yes, this disciple will remember. I won't let you down again. Zhang Ge lowered his head in shame. There were still countless defeated soldiers from Dongshuan's side fleeing for their lives. At the same time, there was also the thunderous clatter of hooves coming from where the thick smoke was rising. Yutong's cavalry had caught up. Han Sanha listened and chuckled bitterly. The situation that I'm most unhappy about has happened. Fu Baoguo isn't greedy for victory, nor is he panicking. The clatter of the hooves is still grand and orderly. Han Sanha shook his head. Turning defeat into victory is only a wild wish now. Zhang Ge looked disappointed. With my understanding of Fu Baoguo, it's only reasonable and expected for such a situation to occur. It's all right though. Now let me teach you another lesson, Han Sanha said faintly. This lesson is called, the merciful should never command an army. Chapter 5:15. Before his words echoed in the air, Han Sanha's expression turned cold and ruthless as he raised his right hand lightly. What followed was a series of commands that rang out resolutely behind him. In front of them, the countless fleeing Dongxian soldiers saw that they had regained their footing and were regrouping. It was as if hope had dawned upon them, and they were about to return to their troops. However, they were shocked to see tens of thousands of longbows drawn, the arrowheads glinting coldly as they pointed at the sky in front of them. There were many Dongxian soldiers who saw this, but they did not know the purpose of this action and who it was aimed at. Yutong's pursuing troops were still a distance away. They were not even within the range of the arrows. Was this not an aimless shot? Teacher! Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat when he saw the situation. Han Sanha ignored Zhang Ji's call and ordered faintly, "Release the arrows." Swoosh, 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 countless sharp arrows covered the entire sky in an instant. The arrows that blanketed the sky were not aimless. The fleeing Dongxian soldiers who were still surging forward suffered the sudden rain of arrows almost unprepared, collapsing with cries of agony. With just a single wave of arrows, no less than 10,000 routed soldiers were killed on the spot. They were the last part of Dongshuan's fleeing troops, the link between Dongxian and Yutong's pursuing troops. Han Sanha had cut off this link for the sake of the follow-up battle, like a warrior who had cut off his wrist ruthlessly. The rain of arrows stopped as the thick stench of blood permeated the air. The stench of blood had always been a common occurrence on the battlefield, but the source of such a huge commotion and casualties was their own people. It was inevitable that it was different from the past. The entire Dongxian troop suddenly fell into an unprecedented silence. It was the duty of a soldier to obey orders. It was not that the tens of thousands of archers did not know what they were doing, but since the order was given by their superior, they had to execute it. Although they already had a rough idea of what to do, the reality was still shocking and chilling to the core. Since the tens of thousands of archers were acting this way, the other Dongxian soldiers were even more fearful and doubtful. "I know what you want to say," Han Sanha said expressionlessly. "It's not too late to wait for them to rejoin the troop. In fact, as long as we mobilize the Shadow Knights that have already been gathered to support them, they will be able to return safely, right?" Zhang Ge stared straight ahead at the black mass of corpses of his comrades. The corpses were like porcupines. He felt as if his heart was being cut by a knife. For a moment he actually forgot to reply, "But you've forgotten that time waits for no man. Let's not talk about how they're going to deal with Yutong's pursuing troops if they rush over and have no time to get into formation," Han Sanha said coldly. "Furthermore, their so-called return will only cause another wave of chaos to the troops that have already formed their combat capabilities. You have to know that at this point in time, Even the slightest disturbance will cause a huge impact. We won't have the room to reorganize the troops anymore. At that time, as long as the enemy charges and establishes an advantage, they will be able to trigger the panic from before. At that time, it would truly be a crushing defeat, and they would die a graveless death. Han Sanha uttered faintly, "Battle song." Although Han Sanha's voice was nonchalant, his tone was cold and harsh. Zhang Ge shuddered when he heard him, lifting his head in terror. "Teacher, listen carefully, watch carefully. This is the last time I'm teaching you." Han Sanha said rather ominously. "What comes next is another lesson. This time it's called cultivation of aura." Before his words echoed in the air, he waved his hand. Suddenly, a loud roar erupted from the Janissaries. Roar! Then thousands of people roared at the same time. The sound was earth-shattering and deafening. "Fight! Fight! Fight!" All the soldiers and steeds, all the soldiers were energized at once. Then a voice hollered, "Chill with the sword! Mountains and rivers!" The voice was unexpectedly majestic and impassioned. 3,000 Janissaries puffed out their chests at the same time, shouting with all their might, "Chill with the sword, mountains and rivers!" Another person's voice rang out, "Chill with the sword, mountains and rivers!" This time, there were more echoes. "Chill with the sword, mountains and rivers!" It was no longer a call for 100 or 1,000 responses, but tens of thousands of people. Then another voice led the way. "Chill with the sword, mountains and rivers!" All the 200,000 Dongxian soldiers who were already in formation chanted in unison, "Chill with the sword, mountains and rivers." In the end, everyone, be it the injured, the Janissaries or the routed soldiers, roared at the same time, their voices growing more and more uniform, more and more forceful, more and more direct. The flag was waved. The cheering stopped abruptly. However, Zhang Ge could clearly feel the soaring fighting spirit, the invincible aura, coalescing into form amidst these few chants. They were routed soldiers who had just been gathered, but they had formed an aura that was sharper than a dagger in a matter of moments. Zhang Ge even felt a surge of confidence, that even if Fu Baoguo were to arrive with his army, he would be able to fight them with such a troop in his hands. There was only awe in Zhang Ji's heart at this moment. Han Sanha's method of reorganizing the army seemed ordinary, at most, but to be able to achieve such a feat at a time like this, when they were on the losing end, was truly a miracle. It was unbelievable. On the opposite side, Yutong's cavalry appeared amidst the smoke and dust as expected, their ferocious aura not diminishing at all. Han Sanha squinted and said, "The aura has been formed, but it's a pity that the combat power is still incomplete. This is the third lesson I'll teach you, and the last lesson I'll teach you in this life. This lesson is called sacrifice." Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat as he lifted his head to look at Han Sanha, and cried out involuntarily, "Teacher, you!" Han Sanha stared at the opposite side with narrowed eyes. A rush of galloping could be heard as a crimson cloud burst out from Yutong's cavalry formation. It took only a few breaths, but it had already traversed thousands of feet, and arrived before Dongxuan's troop alone. As the crimson cloud arrived, a voice filled with murderous intent rang out. "Han Sanha, since you're already here, do you still think you can leave?" A tall and majestic crimson steed entered Dongxuan's sight. The red steed was taller than ordinary horses by at least 1.5 heads, and its body was almost 2.5 meters tall. Its entire body was covered in red fur, and it stood there like a burning flame, raging endlessly. The pair of horse eyes were filled with intelligence. When their gazes met, Dongxuan's people actually felt a faint sense of disdain. Disdain? This was merely a horse, but it actually gave off the feeling that it did not even consider the 200,000 soldiers in front of it worthy of its attention. It stood there, its red mane floating in the air like flames. It looked at the group as if saying, "All of you are trash." On the horse's back, a person stood tall and straight, equally arrogant and disdainful. That handsome and exquisite face made everyone feel ashamed of their own inferiority. His figure was tall and slender, like a jade tree in the wind. His purple robe fluttered slightly in the wind, but his gaze was like a bolt of lightning, filled with boundless iciness. As he scanned the Dongxian troop in front of him, His gaze focused on Han Sanha. The long saber in the man's hand was still gleaming with a crimson glow. It was a ghastly sight, but there was a hint of a cruel smile on his face. Ha ha ha. Han Sanha's chuckle rang out calmly. His eyes were filled with admiration as he looked at Yun Yang and said with a smile, "So it's young Master Yun who has graced us with your presence. It looks like this old and useless one hasn't guessed wrongly. Young Master Yun is no ordinary person indeed." Yun Yang smiled faintly and said, "I'm very pleased to be looked upon so highly by Marshal Han." This time, Han Sanha's composure struck Yun Yang as something special and unexpected. Han Sanha could feel Yin Yang's deific sense lingering on him. He could not shake it off no matter what he said under such circumstances. He could not help feeling apprehensive. Other than being the publicly acknowledged god of war, Han Sanha also had considerable cultivation-based attainment that was no weaker than old Marshal Chiu or Lung Daoyin. He was already at the pinnacle realm's advanced level. Based on his talent alone, Dongxian might lose a god of war, but it might gain a heaven realm cultivator if he were to devote himself to cultivation. In spite of this, Han Sanha had already circulated his deific consciousness to its maximum, but he still could not break free from Yin Yang's harassment. The only reason was that Yin Yang's cultivation base was far above Han Sanha's, and had reached a height that exceeded Han Sanha's knowledge. Han Sanha was not the only one who was shocked. The experts beside him were equally shocked. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.